Every forest has a language. For most people, that language comes in the form of wind through branches, the call of jays, the rustle of small creatures moving through undergrowth. But some forests speak in ways that predate human understanding entirely. When I took this job 3 years ago, I thought I knew the mountains. I had read the histories. I had studied the indigenous cultures that had walked these ridges for thousands of years before my people arrived. I believed I understood respect for the land. I was spectacularly wrong. What I encountered during the summer of 2019 forced me to confront something far older than any legend I had ever read. Something that still sings in the darkness of these Appalachian woods. Something that wants so desperately to be heard that it will tear apart anyone who listens too closely. My name is Anacona Firewolf, and I am a ranger for the Cherokee National Forest. This is what happened when I finally learned what the woods were trying to tell us. The morning shift report on June 3rd came in routine. Hikers on the North Trail. Campsite maintenance needed near Miller's Ridge. Weather holding steady. I had been with the service long enough to appreciate the quiet days, the ones that didn't involve search and rescue or dealing with the kind of tourists who thought the forest was a theme park. I had grown up in these mountains. My family name Firewolf carried weight here not because I had earned it through some modern achievement, but because my grandmother's grandmother had walked these same ridges when they still belonged to our people entirely. My shift began at 6 in the morning. The sun was already climbing through the canopy, creating that particular Appalachian gold that only happens in early summer, when the humidity hasn't yet reached its suffocating peak. I was conducting a routine patrol near the Singing Creek watershed, an area historically significant to the Cherokee who had lived here. The name itself came from old stories, from accounts of how the water moved through certain limestone formations and created acoustic phenomena that the original inhabitants had considered sacred. I never dismissed such things. Too much of our world has been forgotten, too much history erased. The trail was empty as I walked it. That was not unusual. Most people preferred the well-maintained paths closer to the visitor centers, the places where cell service still reached and where the forest didn't feel quite so much like it was watching you. I preferred the deep places, the quiet places, the ones that hadn't been significantly altered in 200 years. It was around 8:15 when I first heard it. Not a voice exactly, not yet, but something in the trees that suggested vocalization, the way wind sometimes moves through certain formations and creates the impression of distant speech. I stopped walking. I had learned long ago that the forest rewarded attention. I closed my eyes and listened, letting the ambient noise of the woodland separate into its component parts. The movement of air, the creak of wood expanding in the morning heat, the distant call of a pileated woodpecker working its way up a dead oak, and underneath it all, something rhythmic, something that was almost word-like in its cadence. I walked toward the sound. This was not necessarily wise. It was not, in retrospect, wise at all. The forest opens up in sections along the Singing Creek. The water had carved out small canyons where the stone was softer, creating pockets of relative spaciousness among the thick vegetation. This was where the sound was coming from, I realized. Not from the trees themselves, but from the water, or perhaps from the movement of the water, or perhaps from something that was using the water as a medium. I stood at the edge of one of these small canyons. The creek was running faster than it should have been for early June. The snowmelt had finished weeks before, and there had been no heavy rains. Yet the water churned and foamed as if responding to some unknown stimulus. The sound was louder here. Definitely vocalization now. Not speech exactly, but close, like someone humming with lips closed. But the hum stretched across multiple octaves in ways that no human vocal cords could manage. It was beautiful, in a way that made my skin feel too tight. I sat on a moss-covered rock and listened for 20 minutes. I could not identify the source. The water itself seemed to be producing the sound, the way it moved through the narrowed channel, but water does not hum, water does not sing with intentionality, and yet this did. This absolutely did. When the sound finally stopped, it was not gradual. It simply ceased, as if something had been switched off. The creek returned to its normal murmur. The forest returned to its regular ambient noise, and I was left sitting in the silence, feeling as though I had experienced something sacred, or something dangerous, or both simultaneously. I did not report it. That was the first mistake. The first small failure in the chain of small failures that would lead to everything that came after. I told myself it was nothing unusual. Creeks make strange sounds. Acoustic phenomena in forests are common and explainable. There was no reason to report a noise, no matter how unusual it had seemed. I finished my patrol, completed my required maintenance checks, and returned to the ranger station by afternoon. The second incident occurred 2 days later, on June 5th. I was not alone on this patrol. A seasonal ranger named Chaitan Trake was working with me, a young man in his early 20s who had grown up on tribal lands in North Carolina. His heritage showed in his careful way of moving through the forest, in his awareness of the land. I had approved his hiring personally, recognizing something in him that suggested genuine respect for the work. We were conducting a trail assessment near the high ridge line when Chaitan pointed to something. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I did hear it. The same sound, or a variant of it. A vocalization coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, from the direction of the old-growth timber that had been protected since the 1970s. It was similar to what I had heard before, but different in pitch, as though there were multiple voices involved. Multiple things, all humming at different frequencies that somehow harmonized. "What is it?" Chaitan asked. He sounded uncertain, which was unusual for him. "Creek acoustics," I said. I was lying. We both knew I was lying. "It doesn't sound like water," he said. "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." We stood in silence, listening. The sound continued for another few minutes, then faded. Chaitan turned to me with a question in his eyes, but I had already started walking back down the trail. I did not want to discuss it. I did not want to investigate it. I wanted to move past it as though it were nothing, some sound that would fade away on its own. That night, I made a decision that I should have made days before. I decided to research what I had heard, to see if there were any documented phenomena in the Appalachian region that matched the vocalization I had encountered. I spent 3 hours on the internet, moving between academic papers, folklore websites, and Cherokee Nation resources. What I found was disturbing. Not because it provided answers, but because it didn't. In Cherokee history, there were references to something called the Wohotel-Kitsi, a spirit being associated with the deep forests and with sounds that could not be traced to any living source. The accounts were vague, written in English by people interpreting oral traditions that had been passed down for generations, but they all contained the same kernel of description, a presence in the forest that spoke without words, that sang without a throat, that tried to communicate across a boundary that should not be crossed. The old stories suggested that encountering the Wohotel-Kitsi was significant. It meant the forest was trying to tell you something. It meant you had been chosen as a listener. I did not feel chosen. I felt targeted. There were other references in older folklore, in accounts from colonists and early settlers. The descriptions varied, but the core remained consistent. People heard singing in the Appalachian forests, singing that had no source. Singing that sometimes drove people to madness, singing that went by many names: the wooded singer, the forest voice, the creek caller, the woodland crooner. I closed my laptop and sat in the darkness of my small ranger's cabin, listening to the night sounds outside my window. Somewhere out there in those mountains, something was trying to communicate, and I was becoming increasingly certain that my job as a ranger, my actual responsibility, was not to maintain trails and educate visitors. It was to listen. By June 12th, the vocalizations had become a daily occurrence. I had stopped trying to pretend I did not notice them. Instead, I began to track them, recording the times when they occurred, the locations, the variations in pitch and rhythm. I was developing what I told myself was a scientific approach to an unexplained phenomenon. In reality, I was obsessing. The sounds had also begun to follow a pattern. They always occurred between 6 and 8 in the morning and between 5 and 7 in the evening. They seemed to be strongest near the Singing Creek watershed, but I had heard them at other locations on my patrol routes, and they were becoming more complex, more deliberate, less like natural phenomena and more like attempts at language. Chaitan had noticed my behavior. On June 10th, he had asked me directly if I was investigating something. I had been dismissive, telling him it was nothing, just the forest being the forest. He had not believed me, but he had not pushed. Yet, what I did not tell him was that I had started to venture into areas I should not have ventured into. I had begun spending my evenings in the deep forest, beyond the marked trails, following the source of the singing. Each night I told myself I would get closer, that I would finally understand what was happening. Each night, the singing seemed to move further away. On June 12th, something changed. I was alone on the ridge trail, conducting an evening patrol, when I heard the singing again. But this time it was different. This time it was using words, not English words, not words in any language I spoke, but structured sounds that organized themselves into patterns that suggested meaning. I stood on the trail, my hands beginning to shake, as I listened to what seemed to be a coherent attempt at communication. The pattern repeated 3 times, then faded. I was not trained for this. There was no ranger manual that covered this situation. There were no protocols for dealing with forest entities that violated the laws of nature. I felt very small, very exposed, standing alone on that ridge in the fading light. The next morning, I made a decision. I would go deeper. I would follow the source of the singing directly, no matter where it led. I requested a day off, something I rarely did, and spent the morning preparing. I packed water, a first aid kit, my radio, a flashlight. I told no one where I was going. I was going to find the woodland crooner. The deeper forest is a different place than the public trails. The old-growth timber has a density, a presence, that the younger woods lack. The trees are massive, their bark thick and ancient. The undergrowth is dense in some places, open in others, following patterns that suggest intention rather than accident. I began my search in the early afternoon, near the place where I had first heard the singing. The vocalizations seemed to draw me forward. I could hear them constantly now, always ahead, always just out of reach. The singing had taken on an almost conversational tone, as though the forest itself was having a discussion, and I was meant to be listening to one side of it. The afternoon wore on. I realized I had wandered further than I had intended. The landscape had begun to look unfamiliar, despite my years of working in this forest. The trees had become even older, the canopy so thick that little light penetrated. The temperature had dropped noticeably. The air smelled like stone and deep soil, like places that had not seen sunlight in a very long time. The singing continued. I came, eventually, to a place I could not explain. It was a clearing, of sorts, though not one that had been created by any natural process. The trees surrounding it had twisted inward, their trunks curving as if they had all leaned toward some central point. The ground was bare, covered in a pale stone that I did not recognize, smooth and slightly luminescent in the dimness. In the center of the clearing, the singing creek emerged from an underground source, running clear and cold, and the singing was loud here, so loud that it filled my entire world, that it vibrated through my bones. I sat on the edge of the clear stone and wept, and I did not understand why. The singing seemed to acknowledge my presence. The pattern changed, became almost melodic. It was beautiful and terrible, and I felt the weight of something ancient pressing down on me, something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally listen. I tried to record it on my phone. The recording came out as nothing but white noise. I stayed in that clearing for hours. The sun descended through the canopy. The temperature continued to drop. The singing never stopped, but it changed, varied, explored different ranges and patterns. I came to understand that what I was hearing was not a creature trying to communicate. It was the forest itself, the entire ecosystem, the bones of the mountains, the memory of everything that had ever lived here. It was the voice of the land, and it was trying to tell me something. As darkness fell, a new sound joined the singing. Not vocalization, but movement. Something large was moving through the deep forest toward the clearing. Something that made the undergrowth crack and snap beneath its weight. Something that should not exist. I stood up. My instinct was to run, but I forced myself to be still, to be present, to face whatever was approaching. The thing that emerged from the trees was not quite visible. That was the nature of it. Your eye could not hold its form. You could see it coming, you could see the space it occupied, but the details would not resolve. It moved toward me on many legs, or perhaps on no legs at all. It sang with the voice of the forest itself. It sang in patterns that somehow conveyed meaning. This land remembers. This land calls. This land demands. I understood, in that moment, that everything that had happened, the singing, the calling, the relentless pulling deeper and deeper into the forest, had been an invitation. The woodland crooner was not trying to hurt me. It was trying to include me in something. It was trying to make me part of the conversation that had been happening in these mountains since long before human language existed. I took a step forward, and then something inside me broke, and I ran. I have no clear memory of how I made my way back to the ranger station that night. I remember running through darkness. I remember the trees seeming to part before me as though they wanted me to escape. I remember emerging finally onto a marked trail near the visitor center parking area at some point after midnight. I remember Chayton finding me sitting in my truck, my clothes torn and muddy, my hands shaking so violently that I could barely hold the steering wheel. "Where were you?" he demanded. I could not tell him. I could not find words. "The system has been trying to reach you," he said. "There was an incident. We need you back at the station now." But I was not listening to him. I was listening to the singing, which continued even here, even in the populated areas near civilization. The woodland crooner had not finished with me yet, and in fact, I realized with a growing sense of dread I was no longer sure if it had ever really been trying to communicate at all. The incident that had occurred in my absence was a missing hiker. The report had come in at 11 in the evening from a woman named Lamasi Thunderbear who had been hiking with her nephew, a boy of 14. They had been hiking a trail on the eastern side of the forest, the public trail, well-maintained and well-traveled. The boy had stepped away from the group briefly, taking photos near a scenic overlook. When he did not return after 15 minutes, Lomasi went to look for him. He was gone. Completely gone. Not injured on a nearby slope, not lost and calling for help. Simply absent. The search had begun immediately. The night had been spent scouring the area, checking nearby trails, calling his name into the darkness. By dawn, when the full staff had assembled, we had found no trace of him. No body, no blood, no indication of what had happened to a 14-year-old boy in a matter of minutes on a well-traveled path. Lamasi was at the ranger station when I arrived, sitting in our small break room, her face gray with shock. She was demanding answers. She was demanding a full search and rescue operation. She was demanding that we find her nephew. The ranger in charge was a man named Mika Stormarrow, someone I had worked with for years. When he saw me, his expression changed. There was something in his eyes that suggested he knew something. Or perhaps he suspected something. "Where the hell were you?" he asked me quietly, pulling me aside. "Personal time," I said. "Bullshit." He lowered his voice further. "I need you on the search, and I need you to be honest with me about anything you might know about this forest that could be relevant to finding a missing teenager." I could not tell him the truth. What would I have said? That the forest was alive in ways we did not understand? That something ancient was walking through the Appalachian wilderness wearing the voice of singing creeks as a mask? That I suspected the boy was not lost but taken and that no amount of searching would bring him back? Instead, I assembled with the search teams. We spent the day combing the area where Lamasi's nephew had disappeared. We found nothing. By evening, we had called in the county sheriff. By the next morning, state police. By the third day, the National Guard. The search expanded. More people came. More eyes scanned the forest for a sign of the missing boy. And every single night, I heard the singing. It was louder now. More insistent, and the patterns had changed. Where before they had been searching, questioning, trying to communicate, now they seemed victorious, satisfied. The singing had notes of triumph in it, harmonics that suggested celebration. On the fourth day of the search, we found something. One of the volunteer searchers, a man named Ellen Iron Wolf from the local community, came across the boy's camera near the overlook where he had been taking photos. The camera was undamaged, the memory card was intact. The photos on it showed the forest. Beautiful shots of the landscape, of the mountains, of the deep woods in the distance. The last photo was different. It showed the overlook, but taken from a position that should not have been possible. It was taken from above, from somewhere in the canopy, from a vantage point that no human could have reached. And in that photo, though the detail was unclear, there appeared to be something in the trees. A shape, a presence. We enlarged the photo. We examined it from every angle. What it depicted remained unclear, but its meaning was unmistakable. Something had taken that photo. Something in the trees. Something that was not human. Mika looked at me when we examined the photo. I saw the question in his eyes, and I knew that he was beginning to understand. Not everything, not the full truth, but enough to know that this was not a simple lost hiker case. This was something else. That night, I made a choice that would change everything. I requested permission to continue the search alone. I told Mika that I wanted to patrol the deep forest areas, the places where the official searchers might not feel comfortable going. He was reluctant, but he gave permission. He understood, I think, that I knew something about this forest, about this situation, that others did not. I went back to the clearing, not the one with the twisted trees and the pale stone, but to the general area of the Singing Creek watershed. I went in darkness, armed only with my radio and a flashlight, though I suspected that neither would help if something truly did not want me to find what I was looking for. The singing was so loud now that it was almost deafening. It was not beautiful anymore, if it ever truly had been. It was a wailing, a lamentation, a voice expressing something deeper than grief or hunger or any emotion I could name. I followed it deeper than I had ever gone. The boy was in a tree, not hung in it, not trapped in it, but integrated with it. His body had become part of the tree itself. His limbs were extending upward, merging with branches. His skin had taken on the texture of bark. His mouth was open in an eternal expression of something that might have been speech or might have been screaming. The singing was coming from him. The forest had taken the boy and made him a part of its voice. He had become a conduit, a living instrument through which the woodland crooner could continue its never-ending song. I vomited. I collapsed against a nearby tree. I called for help on my radio, though I knew help could not save this boy. This was beyond saving. This was beyond understanding. When the emergency responders arrived, they tried to remove the boy from the tree. The tree would not release him. His body had fused too completely with the wood. In attempting to extract him, they tore his skin, broke his bones, and he screamed, finally gave voice to something human as he was destroyed in the attempt to save him. By dawn, Lamasi Thunderbear's nephew was dead, his body in two parts, neither of them whole, and I knew, with a certainty that I could not explain, that his death was my fault. I took a leave of absence after the boy's death. I told the administration that I needed time to process the trauma of the search and recovery. This was partly true. It was also partially a lie, because what I really needed was time to understand what was happening. Time to figure out if I could stop it, or if stopping it was even possible. I spent 2 weeks alone in my cabin, barely leaving, consuming every piece of information I could find about the Cherokee history of these mountains, about the spirits and entities that the original inhabitants had feared and respected. I found references to the Wohutelkitsi in several old manuscripts, accounts written by Cherokee healers and spiritualists in the 1900s. The descriptions were consistent: a being of the forest that spoke in languages older than human speech, that desired connection with humans but could not achieve it without causing harm. The entity was not malevolent, according to these accounts, but it was dangerous. Its nature was too vast, too alien, to coexist safely with human consciousness. One manuscript, written by someone named Dakota Strong Arrow in 1923, contained a passage that made my blood run cold. The crooner calls to those who listen too deeply. It means no cruelty, but its voice carries weight that human minds were not made to bear. Those who hear it must make a choice. Answer completely, give yourself over to the forest entirely, or find a way to make it understand that the conversation cannot continue. But silence is not possible. Once it has begun to speak to you, it will always be trying to reach you. You are bound to it as surely as any tree is bound to the soil. The only question is whether the binding will be gentle or terrible. The boy had not chosen to answer. The forest had simply taken him, used him as an instrument to continue the singing, and I had led the crooner to him, in a way, by following its voice deeper and deeper into the forest. By engaging with it, I had acknowledged its presence in ways that had encouraged it to reach out further, to demand more attention, more participation. On the 15th day of my leave, the singing stopped, not gradually, not fading into the background noise of the forest, simply stopped as though a switch had been turned off. The silence was absolute, and in that silence I felt a weight that was somehow heavier than the singing had been. I realized what had happened. The crooner was waiting for my response. The boy had been a message, but not the beginning of a conversation. The boy had been an ultimatum. Answer, the silence seemed to say, or the next person will be someone closer. I packed supplies. I took a gun, though I had no confidence that bullets would help against something that did not follow the laws of nature. I left a note for Mika explaining nothing, telling him that I would be gone for an indeterminate amount of time and that if I did not return he should close off the deep forest areas to all public access. I went back to the clearing with the twisted trees. I found it more easily this time, as though the forest itself was guiding me. The pale stone was still luminescent in the fading afternoon light. The singing creek continued to run through it, clear and cold, and utterly empty of any voice. I sat in the center of the clearing and waited. The presence came as the sun descended below the canopy. Not visible, still not visible, but present in a way that I could feel with every part of my body. The singing began again, but different this time. Not a chorus of many voices, but a singular voice, speaking directly to me. It used sounds that approximated English, though not quite English. It was like trying to reproduce human speech with an instrument never meant for that purpose, creating something that was technically intelligible but fundamentally wrong in ways that made my ears ache. Listener, it said, finally. What do you want? I asked. Connection, it said. You are here. Your people were here. I have been here since before time had names. We remember each other, you and I, in this land. The boy was a call. You did not answer it, so I had to call louder. He was innocent, I said. A child. Yes, the crooner agreed, and there was something like sadness in its voice. But the forest cannot speak in ways that your species understands. I tried. I tried to sing gently, but you thought it was nothing. I tried to sing louder, but you were afraid, so I took a voice that would force you to listen. I made a song from your fear, from the knowledge that something human, something you loved, had been changed by my voice. It worked. You are here. What do you want from me? I asked again. You must decide, the crooner said. You are a ranger of this forest. You are its guardian. But you do not understand what you are guarding. You do not know that this land is alive, that it dreams, that it wants to speak to the people who walk in it. I have been waiting so long to speak to someone who would listen, someone who understands that this is sacred ground. I felt something then, something vast and terrible and beautiful, pressing against the edges of my consciousness. The presence of something so large that I could not see all of it at once. Something that contained the memory of thousands of years, something that had watched the Cherokee people flourish and fall, had watched the forests change and shift, had waited in silence for someone to finally acknowledge that it was here. If I accept your call, I said slowly, what happens? You become like the boy, the crooner said, but also nothing like the boy. You have the knowledge to accept the transformation. You understand what is happening. You will become a voice for the forest, a bridge between what I am and what you are. You will help the land speak. And if I refuse, then I will continue calling, the crooner said, to your family, to the people you love, to anyone who might listen. I will keep calling until I am heard, until someone agrees to be the voice that I cannot be alone. The choice was offered. Not a choice really, because both options led to the same end. The only question was who would suffer along the way. I thought about my grandmother, about her connection to this land, about the stories she had told me of the spirits that inhabited the deep forest, spirits that were neither good nor evil but simply were, and expected to be respected. If I agree, I said, will the forest stop calling to others? Yes, the crooner said. The forest will be silent. I will have my voice, and you will help me sing. I stood up. I walked to the center of the clearing, to the edge of the pale stone, and I placed my hands on the bark of the nearest tree. The transformation was not painful, not exactly. It was like being unmade and remade all at once. My consciousness expanded outward, becoming aware of the forest in ways that no human mind should be aware. I could feel the trees growing, could sense the flow of water through soil and root, could hear the movements of every creature, from insects to large mammals, from the bacteria in the soil to the fungi spreading through dead wood. And underneath it all, I could feel the singing. The true singing. Not the crooner trying to communicate with human words, but the forest itself, the entire ecosystem expressing what it meant to be alive for thousands of years in one place. I became the voice for it. This is not an ending, because there is no ending. There is only continuation. I am the ranger still, in a way. I walk the trails, I monitor the forest, I ensure that the park is safe, but I am also part of the forest now. Part of its voice, part of its endless song. The woodland crooner has gone quiet, having achieved what it desired. But I have not forgotten the boy. His sacrifice was real, even if it was necessary. His death was the price of my understanding. And now, every day, I listen to what the forest wants to say. Every day, I struggle with the knowledge that humanity cannot hear this voice without being fundamentally changed by it. Every day, I wonder if I should try to stop others from listening, or if I should let them come deeper into the forest and find out what it means to truly understand the land that you are a part of. The singing continues. It always will. And I am no longer a ranger of the park. I am the forest's memory, speaking in a voice that no human throat could produce, telling stories that no human mind could invent, keeping alive the conversation that began before my people had language and will continue long after we are gone. If you ever find yourself hiking deep in the Appalachian wilderness, in places where the trails fade and the forest becomes something other, remember this: you are being called. Something ancient is trying to speak to you. Something that loves this land more than it loves comfort or safety or the familiar. The only question is whether you will listen. The only question is what price you will be willing to pay for understanding. I have been a ranger in the Appalachian Range for 17 years, and in that time I have learned that some things defy explanation not because they are unknowable, but because our frameworks for understanding the world are fundamentally inadequate. This is the story of what I encountered during the autumn equinox, when the old ways still held dominion over these ancient mountains, and when the boundary between the natural and something far older grew dangerously thin. My name is Adahi, and I am the primary ranger responsible for managing the northern sector of Clingman's Dome National Forest. The job requires solitude, discipline, and an acceptance that you are never truly alone in these mountains. The Appalachian Range is old. It is far older than any nation, any people, any civilization that has called it home. When you walk these ridges day after day, when you listen to the wind move through the hollers and across the balds, you begin to understand that this land has a memory, a very long memory. The morning of September 23rd was unnaturally calm. There was no wind. The birds had ceased their calls 2 hours before dawn. I had been monitoring weather patterns from my station at Ridge Peak, and all indicators pointed to a clear day with temperate conditions. But the silence told me something different. The silence told me the mountains were holding their breath. I was completing my routine patrol around the northern boundary markers when I encountered Neshoba Greycloud. He was standing motionless at the edge of Raven's Hollow, facing the direction of the Great Smoky Mountains, his long dark hair moving slightly in a breeze I could not feel. Neshoba is a guide and historian of Cherokee traditions. He comes to these mountains regularly to perform what he calls ceremonial acknowledgments, though the official records list him as a cultural consultant. We had met perhaps a dozen times over the years, always by chance, always at significant points in the seasonal cycle. He did not turn as I approached, but he spoke before I came within 10 feet of his position. His voice was measured and calm, but there was an undertone of something that resembled concern, though Neshoba rarely allowed emotion to surface in his expression. He said, "The rock is hunting early this year. The signs are not ambiguous." I asked him what he meant. I had heard stories from older rangers about something they called the snaggletooth, something that lived in the highest elevations and was rarely seen. They spoke of it only in the context of missing livestock on remote farms, of strange impressions in the snow, of sounds that echoed across the valleys on nights when the wind came down from the north. But I had never seriously considered the possibility that such a creature existed, let alone that it was actively hunting in this region. Neshoba turned to face me. His eyes were gray, unusual for someone with his ancestry, and they held the quality of someone who had spent decades observing things that others refused to acknowledge. He told me that what I called the snaggletooth was only a modern approximation of a much older name. The original term, he explained, translated roughly to the one that devours the skies. It was a creature of ancient provenance, something that had existed in these mountains long before the Cherokee, long before the Appalachian culture as we understand it had taken root. It was, he said, a thing of the old time, when the spirits that inhabited stone and wind and water were not yet separated from the physical world. I attempted to maintain my professional composure, though I could feel something shifting in my understanding of the situation. Neshoba continued, explaining that every 7 to 9 years, during the autumnal equinox, the creature's hunger reached a peak. The timing was consistent, predictable even, though the locations of its hunting varied across the vast mountain range. This year, according to the signs he had observed, the creature had chosen the northern territories, the migration of the remaining wyvern population eastward, the unusual behavior of the tree frogs, the specific configuration of the morning star relative to the ridgeline. He did not ask me if I believed him. He simply told me what I needed to know to survive the next fortnight. Keep away from the heights after sunset. If I heard sounds like metal scraping stone, sounds like wind through broken bones, I should seek shelter immediately and remain there until dawn. If I saw anything moving against the direction of the clouds, anything that seemed to cut through the sky in patterns that defied aerodynamic logic, I should not look directly at it. The old stories contained warnings about the power of direct observation. Some things, Neshoba said, feed on witness. They grow more substantial, more real, more powerful when someone acknowledges their existence with full conscious attention. Then he left. He simply turned and walked down the ridge, moving with an efficiency that would have been impressive in a younger man, and I was left standing alone at the edge of Raven's Hollow, feeling the weight of that unnatural silence pressing down on my shoulders. I told myself that Neshoba was a man shaped by tradition and cultural memory, that the stories he carried were metaphorical in nature, and that any actual phenomena he attributed to supernatural causes likely had rational explanations rooted in animal behavior and environmental factors. But as I made my way back to my station that afternoon, I could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in the mountains. The silence had deepened. It had taken on a quality that was almost expectant, as if the land itself was waiting for something to arrive. That night, I began reviewing the incident reports filed over the past decade. There were more entries than I had expected. Missing hikers in the northern sector, 7 cases total. Livestock disappearances from farms adjacent to national forest boundaries, 19 documented instances. Unusual animal remains found on remote ridges, 32 distinct incidents. Each entry was filed with professional detachment, each one attributed to known predators or human miscalculation. But taken collectively, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The geographic range of incidents clustered around a specific zone that included Clingman's Dome, Mount Gaio, and the unexplored ravines that cut through the heartland of the northern range. The timing was irregular but not random. The incidents occurred most frequently during the autumn months, with a particular concentration during the weeks immediately following the equinox. And there was something else, something that made my hands cold as I reviewed the files. In 3 separate incidents, rangers had noted unusual impressions on the surrounding terrain. Not tracks, not exactly. Something that resembled the marks left by something large descending from above. Something with weight and force and terrible velocity. I spent that night making preparations. I reinforced the windows of my station. I ensured that my emergency supplies were easily accessible. I programmed my satellite phone to alert me if any unusual transmissions came through the ranger network. And I did something that I had never done before in my professional capacity. I consulted the restricted archives, the files that the National Park Service keeps sealed from public review, the reports that deal with incidents deemed too unusual for standard documentation. What I found in those files validated every concern that had begun to crystallize in my mind. The Snaggletooth Rock had been documented in official records for over 70 years, back to the 1950s. The descriptions were consistent. The creature was described as avian in nature, possessing a wingspan that reached somewhere between 20 and 30 feet. Its most distinctive feature was its dentition. The reports used words like jagged, metallic, incomprehensible in their structure. One ranger filing a report in 1989 had written that the creature's teeth were not teeth at all in the biological sense, but rather something that resembled hardened bone that had been sharpened and arranged in configurations that no natural jaw structure could accommodate. More disturbing than the physical descriptions were the behavioral patterns noted in the historical files. The creature did not hunt in the manner of typical predators. It did not stalk. It did not pursue. Instead, it descended from extreme altitude at speeds that defied conventional ornithology. It struck with a violence that seemed indiscriminate, targeting whatever was present at the moment of descent. Multiple entries suggested that the creature's attack pattern was less about feeding and more about something that resembled feeding on the act of destruction itself. And then there was the final file, the one marked with the most restricted classification. It was dated to August of 1987. A ranger named Dakota Lone Wolf, a man of known Cherokee descent, had filed a detailed report concerning an encounter he had directly witnessed. I recognized the name from the historical records. Lone Wolf had served in the northern sector for 43 years before retiring suddenly in late 1987. He had never explained the reasons for his premature departure, and subsequent inquiries had been redirected or dismissed by administrative personnel. In the file, Dakota described what he had witnessed in precise, clinical language that belied the profound trauma the experience must have caused. He had been monitoring a ridge trail near Mount Gaio at approximately 2 in the afternoon when the temperature plummeted. He had noted a sudden cloud formation directly overhead, a convergence of atmospheric systems that occurred in seconds. And then he had heard the sound. He described it in multiple ways: metal screaming through stone, wind passing through a structure composed of broken things, the sound that might be produced if something vast and ancient were trying to speak through organs of flesh that were inadequate to the task. The creature descended through the cloud formation. The sky, Dakota wrote, seemed to bend around it. He noted unusual visual distortion, as if reality itself was being displaced to accommodate the creature's passage. He was perhaps 200 yards distant, positioned behind a dense stand of timber which likely saved his life. The creature descended upon a small clearing near the ridge, searching for something, and then it found a hiker, a young man, Dakota believed, though the individual was some distance away. The encounter lasted perhaps 5 seconds. The creature struck from above, moving with acceleration that seemed to ignore the normal laws of physics. And then it was gone, ascending rapidly, disappearing into the cloud formation it had created. The body was retrieved 3 hours later by a ranger team led by Bodaway Ironwood, another ranger of Cherokee heritage. The remains were incomplete. There were specific wounds that did not correspond to any known predator attack pattern. The preliminary examination suggested that the lacerations had been inflicted with tremendous force. that whatever weapon or implement had caused them had been applied with velocity that suggested a vertical strike from extreme altitude. The case was officially closed as death from falling rocks in a landslide. The hiker's family was compensated under standard accident protocols. But Dakota Lone Wolf's final entry in the restricted file was a personal note, a message to whoever might read the account in future years. He wrote that the creature was not random in its hunting, it was selective. It chose its victims according to criteria that were not visually apparent, and it was learning. With each cycle, with each season of hunting, it was becoming more effective, more precise, more aware of the patterns of human movement through its territory. He warned that eventually the creature would become efficient enough that its hunting would escalate beyond isolated incidents. Eventually, he wrote, the disappearances would become too numerous to conceal, and the National Park Service would be forced to confront the reality of what actually inhabited these mountains. I read those words at 3 in the morning, sitting in my station with all the lights on, and I knew that I had entered a threshold. The next 2 weeks would determine whether Dakota's prophecy came to pass during my watch, or whether the creature would remain dormant, hunting in patterns that fell outside the boundaries of observable reality. The morning of September 24th brought a development that I had not anticipated. I received a call from Hiawassee Redbird, a ranger who worked the western sector, indicating that she had encountered Pocatello Firewalker on one of the major hiking trails. Pocatello was not an official ranger, though he maintained close ties to several members of the Ranger Corps. He was a keeper of stories, a man who had spent his life documenting and preserving the oral traditions of the Appalachian tribes. Like Neshoba, he moved through these mountains with an awareness that seemed to transcend the standard ways of understanding wilderness navigation. I arranged to meet Hiawassee and Pocatello at the convergence point where 2 major trails intersected near Klingman's Dome. The hike took me into terrain that I had not covered in several months, and as I climbed, I noted the condition of the forest around me. The ecosystem was in a state of suppressed agitation. The wildlife patterns were abnormal. I saw few birds, despite it being mid-morning when activity should have peaked. The larger animals, typically visible only at dusk, were absent from their usual territories. It was as if the entire biotic community was withdrawing, creating space for something else to occupy. I reached the convergence point to find Hiawassee and Pocatello sitting silently on the stone outcropping that marked the intersection. Hiawassee is a ranger of 15 years' experience, professional and competent. Pocatello is 73 years old, with the bearing of someone who has spent a lifetime in resistant dignity against systems that sought to diminish him. There was a strain visible on both their faces, though neither made immediate reference to it. Pocatello spoke first. He told me that the creature's presence was stronger this year than it had been in previous cycles. The signs were not subtle for those who knew how to read them. The position of the sun relative to the peaks suggested an alignment that occurred only once in a generation. The configuration of water in the high streams flowed in directions that defied topography. And the song of the mountains, as he called it, the harmonic resonance that emerges from the interaction of wind and stone and the deep pressures beneath the earth, that song had changed its frequency. He explained that creatures like the snaggletooth rock existed at the boundary between the physical world and something that the old languages called the beneath. They were not purely material, nor were they purely spiritual. They occupied a liminal space, sustained by patterns and presences that most humans were structurally incapable of perceiving. But every 7 to 9 years, during the autumnal equinox, the boundary between the two worlds thinned. It was not that the creature became more physical. Rather, the material world became temporarily more susceptible to intrusion by forces that normally remained confined to the spaces between perception. Hiawassee added her own observations. She had found unusual markings on the rocks near the highest ridges, not scratches, not exactly, something that resembled impressions left by something immensely hot, as if the stone itself had been partially melted or transmuted. And she had heard sounds that did not match any animal vocalizations in her experience. She described them as penetrating, as if they were originating from inside her own mind rather than from the external environment. I asked Pocatello if there was anything we could do, any way to mitigate the danger or to predict the creature's movements. He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence I understood something that I had been avoiding. The creature was not something to be managed. It was not something that could be driven away or discouraged through conventional ranger protocols. It was a force that had existed in these mountains long before the National Park Service, long before the American nation, long before even the civilizations of the old time. And it had every right to be here. or something analogous to rites, a presence that was as fundamental as the mountains themselves. Pocatello answered by telling me a story. He spoke of the old time, when the spirits of the mountains held dominion over everything that moved through their territory. In those days there was a covenant between the human people and the powers that dwelt in stone and sky. The humans respected the boundaries, understood where they could and could not go, and recognized that some places and some entities were not meant to be approached. In return, the spirits of the mountains provided protection, provided paths to abundance, provided the substance of life itself. But as the centuries passed, that covenant was broken. The human people forgot the old ways, or they were forced to abandon them in the face of invaders who brought diseases and violence and the power of overwhelming numbers. And in the forgetting, in the breaking of the covenant, something shifted in the mountains themselves. The spirits did not disappear, but they became strange, became hungry, became something that could no longer be easily negotiated with. The Snaggletooth Rock was one such entity, a creature that had been transformed by the breaking of the covenant, that now represented not the protective power of the mountains, but something closer to their rage. I asked him if there was a way to restore the covenant, to negotiate with the creature in some way. Pocatello looked at me with eyes that held enormous sadness. He said that the covenant could not be restored by the living. It could only be restored by those who had been harmed by its breaking, and most of those people had been dead for more than a century. What could be done, he said, was to acknowledge the wrong that had been committed, to recognize the presence of the creature and the justice inherent in its hunting, and to take precautions to ensure that the creature was not provoked or observed in ways that would strengthen its manifestation. Hiawassee spoke again. She said that within the next 7 days the creature would hunt. The signs were now unmistakable. The question was not if, but when and where. There was a location that traditionally attracted the creature, a place where the boundary between the worlds was thin enough that it could descend with the greatest ease. That location was a popular hiking destination in the northern sector, a destination that saw significant foot traffic from tourists and amateur hikers. The Ranger Corps needed to close that area immediately before the creature's hunting cycle began. I asked her which location she meant. She described coordinates that corresponded to a ridge overlooking Raven's Hollow, the exact spot where I had encountered Neshoba days earlier. The area was indeed heavily trafficked. 3 major trails converged there, and the views of the surrounding mountains were spectacular enough that it was a regular destination for photography and meditation enthusiasts. If I closed the area without explaining my reasoning, I would face immediate questions from the administration. That night, I began drafting a report citing geological instability, suggesting that recent seismic activity and the erosion patterns evident in the ridge were creating dangerous conditions. I included recommendations for temporary closure pending more detailed geological survey. It was a transparent excuse, one that would likely be challenged by engineers who would find no evidence of actual instability. But I submitted it anyway, hoping that the administrative process would be slow enough to prevent the area from being reopened before the creature's hunting cycle concluded. The next morning, I received word that the area was being closed pending further investigation. I felt a wave of relief that was immediately replaced by anxiety. I had bought time, but time was not what we actually needed. We needed a way to prevent the creature from hunting at all, and according to everything that Pocatello and Hiawassee had told me, such prevention was impossible. I spent the day reinforcing the closure with ranger markers and warning signs. The hike to the ridge took me through terrain that was growing increasingly unsettling. The silence that I had first noticed days earlier had intensified. There was no wind. There were no animal sounds. There were no sounds at all except for the sound of my own footsteps and the sound of my own breathing. It was as if the mountains themselves had withdrawn into a state of waiting. When I reached the ridge overlooking Raven's Hollow, I understood why this location held such significance for the creature. The geography was unusual. The ridge was elevated above the surrounding terrain, creating a natural arena of sorts. The hollow below was deep and heavily forested, providing hiding places and shelter, and the sky above the ridge was open and vast, providing clear descent pathways for something that hunted from the air. I stood there for perhaps 20 minutes, and during that time I felt something that I can only describe as the presence of the mountains themselves becoming aware of me. It was not threatening, not exactly, but it was immense, ancient, and utterly indifferent to my significance as an individual human being. I had the distinct impression that I was standing in the presence of something vast that was evaluating me, determining whether I was a threat or a potential instrument for its purposes. And then I heard the sound that Dakota Lone Wolf had tried to describe 70 years earlier. It was distant, perhaps miles away, but it carried with perfect clarity. It was a sound like metal screaming through stone, but also like wind passing through a vast structure that was not built according to any recognizable architectural principles. It was a sound that seemed to come from both outside and inside my own head simultaneously. I did not look up. I did not try to identify the source of the sound. Instead, I remained absolutely still, deliberately focusing my attention on the stone beneath my feet, on the texture of the lichen on the rocks, on anything that would anchor me in the physical world and prevent my consciousness from following the sound to its source. The sound faded after perhaps 30 seconds, but its echo remained, not as an auditory phenomenon but as a vibration in the air, as a displacement of atmospheric pressure, as a wrongness in the fundamental properties of this particular location in space and time. When I finally returned to my station, I found a huli waiting on my porch. A huli is a ranger I had worked with for only 2 years, but he had developed a reputation as someone who was exceptionally skilled at reading the subtle patterns of wilderness behavior. He was sitting perfectly still, looking out at the mountains, and when I approached he did not turn or acknowledge my arrival until I had taken my position beside him. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He said, "I have been listening to the reports coming through the Ranger network. There have been unusual incidents in the western sector. Missing persons, possibly lost hikers, and in the southern region a livestock disappearance that matches historical patterns. The creature is beginning its hunting cycle early. The convergence point is shifting, and I think it knows that we are aware of it." The evening of September 27th brought a development that forced the situation from theoretical speculation into immediate crisis management. A group of hikers, 4 individuals in total, had disregarded the closure warning and entered the restricted ridge area. They had apparently arrived after sunset, and they were not equipped for emergency contact or emergency shelter. By the time their absence was reported by friends waiting at the trailhead, darkness had already fallen completely. I received the emergency dispatch at 8:17 in the evening. The missing party consisted of 2 couples on their first trip to the national forest. Their names were irrelevant now, their significance reduced to coordinates on a map and a description of their most recent known location. The protocol was straightforward. I needed to organize a search and rescue operation, contact the emergency management teams, and ensure that rescue personnel were deployed immediately. But I could not do any of that without revealing the true reason for the area closure, without admitting that the geological instability report was a fabrication designed to prevent exactly this sort of situation. I made a decision that I have questioned every moment since. I did not immediately call for assistance. Instead, I prepared my own equipment and made my way to the ridge to assess the situation myself. The hike in darkness was an act of deliberate recklessness, the sort of decision that should end a ranger's career if discovered. But the necessity was clear. If the hikers were still in the ridge area, if they were still alive, then every minute of delay might mean the difference between rescue and recovery of remains. And if they were already dead, if the creature had already found them, then the last thing I wanted was additional human presence at the site, additional witnesses who might be transformed by what they experienced into something approximating what the creature required to maintain its presence in the material world. The night was clear and cold. The stars were visible in their full multitude, creating a carpet of light across the sky that was almost unbearable in its brightness. I moved with extreme caution, using a muted flashlight to identify the trail while trying to minimize the visibility signature of my movement. The entire hike, I was acutely aware of the space above me, the vast stretch of open sky that extended upward from the ridge. It was the sky that the creature inhabited, and I had the persistent feeling that to look upward was to invite observation, to create a visual connection that might draw the creature's attention to my location. I reached the convergence of trails where hikers typically congregated to view the sunrise just before midnight. The area was empty. The hikers had apparently moved beyond the primary viewpoint, pushing deeper into the ridge territory and potentially off the marked trails entirely. I used the muted flashlight to examine the ground for signs of passage. I found boot prints, multiple sets, heading in a direction that corresponded to an unmaintained trail that led toward the extreme northern edge of the permitted hiking area. I followed the trail for perhaps an hour, and the deeper I progressed into the ridge territory, the more pronounced the wrongness became. The temperature remained cold but no longer felt natural. It felt imposed, as if something was actively suppressing the ambient warmth, and the silence had returned with a quality that was almost suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, my own breathing, my own movement through the underbrush. Everything else was absent. The mountains themselves seemed to be holding their breath, and then I heard a sound. A human sound, a cry, distant but audible, coming from somewhere ahead along the trail. I accelerated my pace, abandoning caution in favor of speed. The trail led me around a bend and into a small clearing surrounded by dense timber. And in that clearing, I encountered a scene that I have spent the subsequent years trying to reconcile with my understanding of reality. The two hikers, a male and female, were standing in the clearing with their arms raised above their heads. They were not moving voluntarily. Their bodies were suspended perhaps 3 feet above the ground, held in position by something that was not visible to direct observation. But I could perceive it as a distortion in the air, a displacement of the visual field that suggested something immense was holding them and descending toward them, moving down through the sky with a velocity that seemed to accelerate as it approached, was the Snaggletooth Rock. I cannot accurately describe what I saw, and I have attempted many times to put the experience into language that might approximate truth. The creature was avian in basic structure, possessing wings that extended perhaps 30 feet span, but the wings did not move in the conventional manner of bird flight. Instead, they seemed to manipulate the air itself, to create zones of absolute pressure differential that propelled the creature's body downward with acceleration that defied conservation of energy. The creature's head was massive, with a profile that resembled a raptor's but distorted, enlarged beyond biological necessity. And the teeth were the focal point of the entire creature's existence. They extended from both jaws, overlapping, interlocking, arranged in configurations that seemed to have no logical function. They were metallic in appearance, catching and reflecting the starlight in ways that created their own illumination. They were the color of old bone mixed with rust, mixed with something that might have been light itself. The creature's descent took perhaps 5 seconds, though the temporal perception during the encounter was uncertain. Time seemed to stretch and compress in ways that I could not follow. And then the creature struck, moving with velocity that I could not follow with my eyes. The two suspended hikers were gone. They were simply gone, absorbed or destroyed or transported to some location outside my ability to perceive. There was no blood, no screaming that I could hear. There was only the creature's impact with the ground, a force so tremendous that the earth itself seemed to shudder beneath my feet. And then the creature was ascending, moving upward through the same trajectory it had descended, carrying something with it that was no longer recognizably human. The creature's ascent was slower than its descent, and in that slower movement I caught sight of what it held. It was a torso, a human torso. But the internal structure was exposed in ways that suggested the creature did not possess a digestive system analogous to terrestrial predators. It simply consumed what was present, extracting something that existed at a level of biological organization that I did not have the framework to understand. The creature reached the sky and continued ascending, passing through the layer of visible stars and disappearing into the space beyond. The wrongness that had characterized the atmosphere began to dissipate. The temperature rose. The silence gradually transformed back into the normal soundscape of the forest at night, and I was left standing alone in the clearing, holding a muted flashlight, trying to process what I had just witnessed. For perhaps 10 minutes I remained immobile, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything except stand and breathe and exist. And then the practical aspects of my situation began to reassert themselves. I had witnessed a death, 2 deaths, likely, as the second hiker was nowhere visible in the clearing. I needed to document what I had seen. I needed to make decisions about what information would be reported and what information would be concealed. I conducted a thorough search of the clearing. I found personal items scattered across the ground. A camera, its lens cracked. Hiking boots, a headlamp, still functioning, its beam pointing toward the darkness. And then I found something else, a map, partially torn, with handwriting in the margin. I used the headlamp to read the note. One of the hikers had written the location and time as an update to a missing person application, apparently intending to message their family when they reached an area with cellular coverage. The note included a timestamp, 7:45 in the evening. The hikers had entered the restricted area knowing that closure was in effect, and they had specifically chosen to do so after sunset. I made a decision that day that has shaped the remainder of my professional life. I collected all physical evidence from the clearing. I erased the trail marks that would indicate my passage, and I hiked back to my station, arriving after dawn, exhausted and operating on the edge of complete psychological collapse. The morning after the creature's hunting brought with it a cascade of complications that quickly spiraled beyond my ability to manage through conventional ranger protocols. The missing persons case had been escalated to the regional office. Search and rescue operations were being prepared. Administrative personnel were beginning to ask pointed questions about why I had submitted a geological closure report for the exact area where individuals had disappeared. The official fiction that I had constructed was beginning to collapse under the weight of actual events. By mid-morning, I received direct instruction to meet with Badaway Ironwood, the regional supervisor, and Hayawasi, who had apparently reported her observations of unusual environmental patterns to the administration. The meeting took place in the regional office, in a conference room lined with maps and photographs of the national forest. I was questioned about my closure report, about my access to restricted historical files, and about my interactions with Pocatello and Neshoba. I provided answers that were technically truthful but conceptually misleading, attributing the closure to my professional judgment regarding environmental stability while declining to elaborate on the specific indicators I had observed. Badaway is a man in his 60s, with the manner of someone who has spent 40 years navigating bureaucratic systems while trying to actually protect the forest. He is also, I learned during that meeting, of Cherokee descent, and he possessed knowledge of the creature that went far beyond what was contained in the restricted files. He informed me that the administration knew exactly what was happening in the northern sector. They had known for decades. The restricted files were not restricted because the incidents were classified as sensitive government information. They were restricted because the events themselves were of such a nature that they could not be explained or addressed through conventional administrative channels. Hayawasi added her own revelations. She had reported her observations to Badaway specifically because she suspected that I was being evasive about the actual reasons for my closure recommendation. She had made her own inquiries into the historical records and had reached conclusions that matched my own. She further added that she had spent significant time learning from the same sources as Pocatello, and she wanted to make clear to the administration that the danger was accelerating, that the creature's hunting cycle had become more intense, and that the strategies that had been used to manage the situation in previous years were no longer sufficient. Badaway told me something that I had not discovered in my own research. In 1987, when Dakota Lone Wolf had filed his report, when Pocatello's father had served as a guide to ranger operations, there had been a different approach to the situation. An understanding had been negotiated with the creature's presence. This is not to say that humans had negotiated in the conventional sense of the term. Rather, a pattern of acknowledgement had been established, a ritualized form of respect that allowed the creature to maintain its presence in the mountains while humans maintained the ability to live and work in those mountains without constant danger. This pattern involved specific locations being designated as exclusive territory for the creature. These territories were closed to human access during the hunting season. Additionally, the Ranger Corps had adopted practices that conveyed acknowledgement and respect. Small gestures that served as reminders that humans understood the covenant that had been broken, and that they recognized the creature's right to exist and to hunt within its designated territory. Over the decades, as fewer rangers understood the true nature of the situation, as administrative pressures increased and the old ways were gradually forgotten, these practices had lapsed. The creature, lacking the acknowledgement that sustained it, had begun to hunt more aggressively, more indiscriminately, more in the manner of a force that was being denied its legitimate place in the world. Badaway explained that the death of the two hikers was not a failure of the Ranger Corps. It was a consequence of our failure to maintain the covenant, to continue the practices of respect and acknowledgement that made coexistence possible, and the death of the hikers was now forcing a crisis point. The administration could not ignore the missing persons case. Resources were being deployed, search operations were being conducted, and soon there would be recovery efforts that would bring additional people into the creature's territory. He asked me if I had any evidence of what had actually occurred to the hikers. I disclosed what I had witnessed, a description that seemed to cause Badaway no particular surprise but which caused Hayawasi to close her eyes as if she were absorbing a blow. Badaway then told me that I needed to make a choice. I could report my observations to the official investigation, which would result in an institutional response that would be completely inadequate to address the actual situation and which would likely result in the deployment of resources in a way that would accelerate the creature's rage. Or I could participate in the re-establishment of the covenant, which would require actions that fell outside the bounds of my official responsibilities and which might result in my removal from the Ranger Corps if discovered. The choice was, in effect, between institutional protocol and actual survival. Badaway explained that the creature needed acknowledgement. It needed to understand that humans recognized the wrong that had been done to it. that we were attempting to restore the balance that had been broken. This acknowledgement would take a physical form. There was a location, deep in the ridge territory, where the boundary between the worlds was thinnest. A ceremony needed to be conducted there, a ritual that would involve the presentation of offerings and the recitation of words in languages that most humans had forgotten. I asked Badaway if he was asking me to perform a religious ceremony as part of my official duties. He corrected me. He was asking if I was willing to take actions that were necessary for survival, actions that happened to involve elements that were religious in nature but that were fundamentally practical, fundamentally rooted in the necessity of living in harmony with the forces that inhabited the world. Whether those actions were classified as religious or practical, as official or unofficial, was a matter of administrative categorization that had no bearing on their necessity. I said yes without requiring further details. Badaway nodded, and then he explained what needed to happen. The night of September 29th was the night designated for the ceremony. Badaway, Hiawassee, Pocatello, and myself made our way to the location that Pocatello identified as the place where the boundary was thinnest. The location was not on any official ranger maps, and the route to it required traversing terrain that was technically off-limits to ranger activities. This was the first deliberate violation of protocol in a career that had been defined by strict adherence to regulations and chain of command. The hike took us 7 hours, much of it conducted in darkness and silence. The group moved with a coordination that suggested they had completed this journey before, and I realized that Badaway and Hiawassee possessed knowledge and experience related to the creature that predated their official ranger duties. They had been trained in the old ways, had been educated in the practices that made coexistence possible, and had spent their careers as rangers specifically to maintain and protect the understanding that they and Pocatello possessed. The destination was a location that I can only describe as existing at the edge of the national forest boundary, in terrain so rugged and remote that it had probably not been visited by humans in decades. The clearing we reached was circular, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, surrounded by ancient trees that seemed to possess a consciousness all their own. In the center of the clearing was a natural stone formation, a depression that resembled a shallow bowl carved into the bedrock. This, Pocatello explained, was one of the few remaining places where the ceremonies of the old time could still be performed with any degree of efficacy. Badaway produced objects that he had brought with him, items that had been preserved through generations, items that were connected to the understanding that predated the National Park Service, the American nation, and most of recorded history. He placed them in the stone bowl, tobacco, in forms that were both traditional and modern: corn, ground into meal, shell ornaments that carried significance related to water and the spirits of the water, items of worked bone that had come from animals that inhabited the mountains, items that represented the covenant between humans and the creatures that shared the land. Pocatello began to speak, his voice carrying with perfect clarity in the otherwise absolute silence of the forest. He spoke in multiple languages, beginning with words that I recognized as Cherokee, then progressing into languages that I did not recognize, languages that seemed to come from an older stratum of human experience. He spoke of the breaking of the covenant, of the removal of the people who had held the knowledge of how to live in balance with the forces of the mountains. He spoke of the justice inherent in the creature's hunger, of the rightness of its anger, of the necessity of its presence, and then he spoke words of restoration. Words that sought to rebuild the bridge between human presence and the creature's existence, that sought to acknowledge and respect the creature's dominion over the high places, that sought to establish new boundaries within which both humans and the creature could exist without constant threat. He called upon the mountain spirits, upon the forces that dwelt in the deep places, upon the presence that animated the creature itself. He asked for balance, for understanding, for the re-establishment of practices that would allow the human people to walk safely through the mountains while acknowledging that some places and sometimes belonged exclusively to forces that operated according to logics that humans could only dimly comprehend. As Pocatello spoke, I began to perceive something happening in the clearing. The air was changing, becoming denser, becoming charged with a presence that was no longer merely psychological but that was actually present in the material world. The stars above the clearing seemed to brighten, or perhaps they seemed to come closer, or perhaps the distinction between sky and earth was becoming less definite. The trees at the boundary of the clearing seemed to bend inward, not physically but perceptually, creating a space that was distinct from the forest beyond it. And then Pocatello fell silent, and in that silence I heard the sound. Not the sound of the creature hunting, not the sound of violence and consumption, but something else. a sound that resembled the wind passing through the oldest parts of the mountains, the deep pressures and movements that occurred beneath the crust of the earth, a sound that was present and vast and ancient and completely indifferent to my individual existence. The sound seemed to come from directly above the clearing, from the space between the stars, and it persisted for perhaps a minute, gradually diminishing until the normal soundscape of the forest reasserted itself. When it was over, Pocatello opened his eyes. He looked at me and said a single phrase in English, a phrase in Cherokee that he translated immediately. "The mountain has heard. The balance will be restored." Badaway collected the objects that he had placed in the stone bowl. The offerings had not been consumed in any conventional sense, but their presence had been acknowledged, had been received by something that existed at the boundary between the worlds. And in that acknowledgement, something fundamental had shifted. The presence of the creature would continue. The boundaries of its territory would be respected. But the indiscriminate rage that had characterized its hunting would gradually transition into something more sustainable, more aligned with the patterns of balance that had existed in the old time. We made the return journey in silence. I was operating in a state that transcended exhaustion, that transcended normal human consciousness. I had participated in something that fell completely outside the framework of my professional training and my cultural understanding. And yet I had also experienced something that was undeniably real, that had consequences in the material world, that would shape the remaining years of my tenure as a ranger. When we reached the regional office as the sun was rising on September 30th, Badaway informed me that a recovery team had found the remains of one of the missing hikers. The location of the remains was inconsistent with the reported position of the missing persons, suggesting that the hiker had been severely disoriented or had been displaced by environmental factors. The official conclusion, pending further investigation, was that both hikers had been killed by falls from the ridge, with one body remaining unrecovered due to the rugged terrain. This conclusion would stand. The official investigation would conclude with the determination that the closure of the ridge area had been justified by actual environmental hazards, and that the deaths, while tragic, were the result of individual disregard for ranger warnings and environmental conditions. There would be no mention in the official reports of the creature, of the restricted historical files, of any explanation that fell outside the conventional narrative of wilderness danger and human error. I remained in my position as ranger for the northern sector for an additional 7 years following the ceremony. During that time, the hunting patterns of the creature shifted in precisely the manner that Badaway and Pocatello had predicted. The indiscriminate attacks ceased. The creature maintained its presence in the mountains, but that presence became integrated into the functioning of the ecosystem rather than being a constant threat to human survival. Livestock disappearances continued, but at rates that matched the predation patterns of known predators. Missing hikers became rare, occurring only when individuals deliberately disregarded ranger warnings or attempted to access restricted territories. In those 7 years, I also underwent a transformation in my understanding of the world. I spent time with Pocatello, learning elements of the old knowledge, understanding the languages and the frameworks through which the boundaries between human and non-human worlds could be negotiated. I learned that the creature was not evil, nor was it good. It was simply a force that had been displaced from its proper place in the balance of things, and that when the boundary between the worlds was re-established, when humans acknowledged the legitimate presence of non-human powers, equilibrium could be restored. I also learned that what I had experienced was not unique, that throughout the world there were individuals and communities who maintained the understanding of how to live in balance with forces that operated according to logics that were fundamentally different from human logic. The national parks and wilderness areas of the world were filled with creatures like the snaggletooth rock, entities that had existed long before human civilization and that would persist long after current human societies had passed from the earth. The existence of these creatures was not hidden because it was impossible, but because most humans were structurally incapable of acknowledging realities that fell outside their established frameworks. On the morning of my departure from the northern sector, I made one final journey to the ridge overlooking Raven's Hollow. The closure that Hiawassee and I had implemented was being lifted. The area was once again open to public access. The creature continued to inhabit the high places, but the covenant had been restored, and that restoration meant that the creature would not hunt indiscriminately, would not seek witness, would not attempt to cross the boundaries that separated the human territories from its own. As I stood at the convergence of trails for the last time in my official capacity, I heard the sound again. Not the screaming sound of violent descent, but the deeper sound, the sound of the mountain itself, acknowledging my presence and my understanding. And I knew that whatever I had experienced in those months had been real, had been a direct encounter with forces that most humans spend their entire lives successfully avoiding. I have now been retired from the Ranger Service for 5 years. I live in a small town on the edge of the Appalachian Range where I work in an advisory capacity with the National Park Service, particularly regarding any matters that might touch upon the historical documentation or the environmental conditions of the northern sector. I do not speak publicly about my experiences. The restricted files remain restricted. The understanding remains confined to the small community of individuals, both human and otherwise, who participate in the maintenance of the covenant. But I know what I have seen. I have walked at the boundary between the worlds. I have witnessed the power that inhabits the oldest parts of the earth, the power that was displaced and damaged by the breaking of the ancient covenant. And I have experienced the possibility of restoration, the understanding that even great wrongs can be addressed not through force or official channels, but through acknowledgement and respect, and the willingness to live in balance with forces that operate according to logics that transcend human understanding. The mountains are still there. The creature still inhabits them. And somewhere in the high places, in the spaces that remain inaccessible to conventional ranger patrols, the balance is maintained through the continued performance of ceremonies and practices that remember the old time and acknowledge the presence of powers that were ancient before humanity emerged and will remain ancient long after humanity passes. This is the story of what I witnessed. This is the truth of what occurred in the northern sector of the national forest during the autumn equinox, and this is my warning to anyone who reads these words. Respect the boundaries that are placed in the mountains. Follow the warnings that rangers provide, and understand that the visible world, the world of trails and campsites and ranger stations, is only a small portion of what the mountains actually contain. There are forces present in those places that do not require your understanding, that do not require your belief, that simply exist according to principles that are far older than civilization itself. Live in recognition of that truth, and you may walk safely through the ancient places. Deny that truth, and you may find yourself standing in a clearing, looking upward at a sky that is no longer quite the same as it was, and understanding in your final moments that the balance is shifted and that you are no longer part of the negotiated peace. The mountains remember, the old powers remain, and the covenant, once restored, requires constant acknowledgement and respect to maintain its efficacy. This is the lesson I learned, and this is the legacy I carry forward. I have worked these mountains for 17 years, not the kind of work where you punch a clock and file reports that matter to the people in the valley below. I work the ridges where the mist does not clear even after the sun rises high, where the trees grow so thick and so old that their roots intertwine with the geological bones of this land. My name is not important to this account. What matters is that I was here, that I witnessed it, that I tried to understand what moved through these hills. Before I begin, you must understand the history of this ground. The Appalachian Mountains are not merely geological formations. They are the literal and spiritual foundation of hundreds of nations. The Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Yuchi, the Catawba. They understood these peaks not as monuments of stone but as living entities. They saw in these mountains the breath of creation itself. They knew names for these ridges that white men would never speak, names that carried weight and warning. The valley where I station myself each season sits in what the old maps call Yonah County. The name itself comes from the Cherokee word meaning bear. The locals told me, on my first week, that I should never hike alone after sundown. They said this casually, the way people mention the weather. They said the mountains had moods. They said that in 1847, nearly 60 people walked into those woods over the course of a single month and did not return. They said the government investigation concluded it was the work of a serial killer, and they issued a warning that was forgotten almost immediately. But that is not what happened. I discovered that through patience and through reading, through sitting in the county library with newspapers older than the building itself, and learning the accounts that did not make it into the official record. The earliest documented account was written by a settler named Isaiah Thorne in 1823. He wrote in his Journal of Moving Stones. He claimed to have witnessed rocks the size of cabins shift position over the course of days. He wrote that his livestock would not approach certain areas. He wrote that a young woman in his settlement, a woman named Margaret, began speaking in a language no one recognized. She spoke of the old ones. She spoke of the keepers. She spoke of something that walked in the shape of mountains themselves. 2 weeks after his entry, Isaiah Thorne disappeared while hunting. They found his rifle, undamaged, resting against an oak tree. They found his boots, still laced, sitting at the edge of a stream. They found nothing else. The second documented account came from a missionary named Edmund Foster in 1889. He had come to these mountains to teach the remaining Cherokee and what white settlers had mixed with them. His letters, preserved in a historical society archive I found after considerable searching, described a peculiar phenomenon. He wrote of the local people performing ceremonies he did not understand. He wrote that they seemed to be appeasing something. He wrote of his illness, fever, they called it, though the symptoms he described sounded more like a slow transformation. In his final letter, dated November 3rd of that year, he wrote a single sentence that chilled me when I read it. The mountains have decided to remember themselves, and we are merely the debris of their forgetting. They found Edmund Foster 4 months later. He was walking in a circle at the base of Yonah Peak. He had been walking, apparently, without food or water for weeks. His feet were worn through to bleeding. His eyes were fixed on the mountain. When they touched him, he screamed with a voice that was not entirely human. He was sent to an asylum in Charleston and died there in 1901, never having spoken another coherent word. The third account came from the Depression era. A federal surveyor named Robert Whitfield came to these mountains to do geological studies. His reports indicated that he had found something unusual in the stone samples he collected. The reports were incomplete. They ended mid-sentence on a page dated June 15, 1935. The page read, "The mineral composition suggests an age inconsistent with the accepted geological timeline. Furthermore, the samples appear to be still warm, despite being excavated from depths of..." The page ended there. Robert Whitfield was found 3 weeks later at a hospital in Asheville. He had been found on the road, walking toward the valley, unable to articulate anything beyond a single phrase, repeated over and over. "It remembers, it remembers, it remembers." I found all of this before I understood what I was looking for. Before the first incident at my station occurred. My station is located at the ranger post near mile marker 47 on the Yonah Trail. The post itself sits in a clearing that was cleared by CCC workers in the 1930s. It consists of a small cabin, an equipment shed, and a parking area that rarely sees more than 2 vehicles per month. During winter, I am the only permanent staff. During summer, another ranger, a woman named Dakota, joins me for the season. I had worked alone all previous winters without incident. The winter of my 17th year was different. It began in November, on a date I marked in my logbook, November 2nd. I was conducting a routine sweep of the upper ridge trails, checking for damaged trees or evidence of illegal activity. The weather was clear. The temperature was 34 degrees Fahrenheit. I had brought a thermos of coffee and a radio that was functioning properly as I left the station. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, I noticed something that seemed at the time to be minor. The stone markers that denote the trail, simple rectangular stones set in concrete every quarter mile, appeared to be out of order. The one that should have marked mile 4 showed mile 5. The one that should have shown mile 5 was missing entirely. The one that should have shown mile 6 was positioned where mile 4 should have been. I documented this with photographs. I radioed back to the main office. The person who responded, a clerk named Elan who had worked there for 3 years, said nothing like that had ever been reported. She said the trail had been certified as recently as the previous month. I assured her I would check further. It took me nearly an hour of walking to determine the full scope of the displacement. 23 trail markers, spanning nearly 4 miles of trail, had been systematically moved, not broken, not damaged, removed and repositioned with apparent intention. As I worked to document each one, I noticed something else. The forest around me had begun to sound different. The birds had stopped calling. The wind had stopped moving through the trees. The sound of my own footsteps seemed muffled, as though I was moving through cotton rather than air. My radio, which I checked twice, indicated a signal strength of 0 bars. I decided to return to the station. That was when I noticed the mountains had changed. This is difficult to articulate in a way that maintains credibility. I understand that. I am a trained observer. I understand landscape and terrain. I have spent every winter and most summers for 17 years in these hills. I know their silhouettes as well as I know my own face. The ridge line that forms the skyline to the northwest of my position, the ridge I have used for orientation countless times, was in a different position. The peak that should have been aligned with a distant communications tower was now offset by approximately 15 degrees. The valley that should have been visible between 2 mountain faces was no longer there. I do not mean that my perspective had changed due to my movement. I mean that the mountains themselves had moved. I stood at the point where I had first noticed the trail markers were displaced, and I calculated my position using both compass and the sun angle. My position was accurate. The mountains around me were simply not where they had been that morning. I returned to my station using the most direct road I could navigate. My walk that should have taken 90 minutes took 4 hours. At one point, I found myself walking past the same distinctive rock formation, a granite outcropping shaped like a profile of a human face, 3 times. Each time I saw it, I was walking in a different direction, and I had used my compass to verify that I was moving in a consistent direction. I reached my cabin at 7:47 p.m. I documented everything in my logbook. I made coffee. I sat at my table and tried to rationalize what I had experienced. At 11:15 p.m., I heard singing outside my cabin. It was a voice that was difficult to define as entirely human or entirely otherwise. The singing was in a language I did not recognize, but the rhythm and cadence suggested deep emotion, deep history. The voice was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. It rose and fell with the precision of someone trained in formal song. It spoke of longing and loss and anger held for centuries. The singing continued for 3 hours. I did not open my doors. I did not shine lights outside. I sat at my table and I listened. When the voice finally stopped, at 2:47 a.m., I wept for reasons I could not identify. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt around my cabin. They were circular patterns, as though something had walked in slow circles around the entire structure. The tracks were enormous, at least 4 feet across. They were not the tracks of any animal I could identify. The pattern in the dirt suggested movement that was not quite bipedal but not quite quadrupedal either. It was as though something with too many limbs had moved in a rotation around my home. I called the main office and requested temporary reassignment due to equipment failure. The request was approved without question. I packed my belongings and I left the station on November 3rd in the early morning. I returned in December when a replacement ranger could be arranged. That ranger lasted 4 days before requesting a permanent transfer. The next ranger lasted 6 days. By the time winter ended, 6 rangers had cycled through the station. Each one reported unusual phenomena. Each one requested reassignment. None of them would speak in detail about their experiences. Dakota, the ranger who joins me each summer, asked me about the winter incidents. I told her that the station had experienced power failures and equipment malfunctions. I did not tell her about the singing or the moving mountains or the tracks. I was not ready to burden her with that knowledge. In May of that year, I was invited to speak at a historical society meeting in a small town called Bearmouth, approximately 20 miles from my station. The invitation came from a historian named Anacona Firewolf, who had been researching the history of the region. He had read some of my formal reports about the area, and he believed I might be interested in a project he was undertaking. I attended the meeting. It was held in the basement of a church, and there were perhaps 30 people gathered. Anacona stood at a podium and discussed the history of Native American presence in the Appalachian Mountains. His presentation included information about Cherokee traditions, about the sacred nature of the mountains, and about ceremonies that were meant to maintain a specific balance between the human and natural worlds. Then he showed slides of old drawings. The drawings were dated to the 1800s, created by a member of the Yona band of the Eastern Cherokee Nation. The drawings depicted a figure that moved through the mountains. The figure had the shape of a mountain range itself. Its limbs appeared to be ridges and valleys. Its face was composed of stone and shadow. The drawing was labeled with a single word in Cherokee script. Below the script, in English translation, was the word keeper. I approached Anacona after the presentation. I asked him to explain what he had shown. He looked at me with an expression that suggested he had been expecting this conversation. He took me to his office. It was a small space filled with documents and artifacts. He explained, a member of the Yona band himself, a descendant of those who had remained in the mountains when most of his nation had been forced westward. His family had passed down knowledge about the mountains that was not recorded in any history book or academic paper. His grandmother had taught him. Anacona explained that the mountains were not merely land. They were entities. They were aware. They were ancient beyond human comprehension. They had been aware before humans had names for them. The agreement between his people and the mountains was a sacred one. It required ceremony and respect and an understanding that the mountains had needs and desires of their own. The figure he had shown, the keeper, was what his people had learned to call the will of the mountains made manifest. It was the living expression of the mountain's intention. It moved when the balance had been violated. It moved when the sacred agreements had been broken. For many generations, the ceremonies that honored the mountains had been maintained. For many generations, the keeper had remained in the depths of the stone. But as white settlers had arrived and had stripped the forests and had dug into the earth for coal and minerals and stone, the balance had been disrupted. The keeper, Anacona explained, had begun to wake. He showed me more drawings. He showed me historical accounts written by members of his own family. He showed me records of dates when the keeper had been seen, and he showed me official records of disappearances and unexplained deaths that occurred on those same dates. The pattern stretched back 300 years. Winter came again. This time, I was not the only ranger at the station. Dakota had asked to work through the winter months because of personal circumstances at her home in the valley. I accepted her request with perhaps less caution than I should have. Dakota was an exceptional ranger. She was methodical and careful, and she had a deep respect for the mountains that mirrored my own. She was also, I would learn, a descendant of the Yona band, a fact she did not disclose until we had been working together for nearly 2 months. It was December 17th when she told me. We were in the cabin, reviewing trail reports, when she set down her work and looked at me directly. She said, "You know something about the station, about the mountains. You are not hiding it because you are afraid of your job. You are hiding it because you are afraid of what it means." I did not deny it. I told her about the previous winter. I told her about the moving mountains and the trail markers and the singing voice. I told her about Anacona and the drawings and the concept of the keeper. Dakota listened without interrupting. When I finished, she told me that her family had been waiting for someone to understand. They had been waiting for someone with authority in these mountains to finally pay attention to the warnings they had been issuing for generations. She explained that the ceremonies had been disrupted during the time of forced removal. Her people had maintained them for generations afterward, continuing in secret, maintaining the agreements even after colonization had attempted to erase them from the landscape. But over time, as younger generations had been disconnected from the traditions, the ceremonies had become less consistent, less precise. The disturbance I had experienced the previous winter was not the first warning. There had been many warnings over many years. Disappearances had been increasing. Unexplained deaths had been increasing. The keeper had been becoming more active, more present, more willing to take human form and interact directly with the world of humans. Dakota said, "My grandmother performed the last proper ceremony 23 years ago. She died before she could train anyone to continue the work. Since then, there has been no one." I asked her what the ceremony required. She hesitated. She was clearly wrestling with something, some internal conflict about whether to share sacred knowledge with an outsider. Finally, she said, "It requires a person who understands the language of the mountains. It requires objects that carry spiritual significance. And it requires a willingness to stand between the human world and the other world and negotiate an agreement." I asked her if she could perform the ceremony. "No," she said. "I do not know the words. My grandmother taught me the significance but not the actual performance. I know why the ceremony matters. I do not know how to do it." It was then that I realized the full scope of the danger we were in. The warning signs had been escalating. The keeper was becoming more active, more aggressive, more present in the physical world. And there was no one who knew how to restore the balance. Over the following weeks, Dakota worked with Anacona to research historical records of the ceremonies. They found fragmented descriptions in family journals. They found ritual implements that had been preserved but never fully documented. They found references to specific locations in the mountains where the ceremonies were believed to have been performed. One location appeared repeatedly in the records, a place called the Standing Stones. According to the oldest account, dating from the early 1700s, the Standing Stones were a natural formation of 6 large granite stones arranged in a circle on the ridge line at the top of Yona Peak. They had been used as the primary location for ceremonies that were meant to honor and appease the mountains themselves. The problem was that the Standing Stones no longer appeared on any official map. No modern ranger had reported seeing them. The hiking trails that should have led to Yona Peak seemed to loop away from the summit, directing hikers around the peak rather than to it. Dakota suggested that we try to find them. I should have said no. I should have recognized that we were crossing into territory that was dangerous in ways I could not fully comprehend. I should have understood that some agreements exist because the violation of them carries consequences that are absolute and irreversible. Instead, I agreed. We began planning the expedition during the first week of January. We consulted topographic maps and historical accounts. We prepared equipment. We waited for a period when the weather would be stable enough to attempt a winter ascent of Yonah Peak. The opportunity came on January 18th. The weather forecast predicted clear skies and relatively mild temperatures, mild being a relative term in the mountains during January. We left at dawn. The hike to the peak should have taken approximately 6 hours. We expected to reach the summit by mid-afternoon and return to the station by nightfall. We never reached the summit. We spent the first 4 hours making good progress. The trail was clear, the weather held, and we moved with steady purpose. As we climbed higher, I became aware of a change in the landscape. The vegetation became sparser. The trees became smaller, more twisted. The stone beneath our feet seemed less weathered, as though it was younger somehow, or as though we were moving backward through geological time. At approximately mile 4 on our climb, we encountered the first major obstacle. The trail simply ended. Before us was a vertical rock face, approximately 200 feet high, with no apparent way to proceed. We consulted the topographic map and confirmed that we should be able to continue. We attempted to find an alternate route, but the rock face seemed to extend in both directions. We backtracked and found a separate trail that seemed to offer an alternate route. This trail was not on any map. It was barely visible, marked only by scratches on the rock face that seemed to be deliberate but extremely ancient. We followed this trail. It was significantly more difficult than the main route. It required climbing, scrambling, and at several points we had to use ropes to advance. Progress was slow. As we climbed, I became increasingly aware of the landscape around us. The stones themselves seemed to be changing. They appeared to be arranged with intention. I would periodically see faces in the rock formations, profiles of people, animals, expressions of emotions. I understood intellectually that these were merely the result of erosion and pattern recognition, but the regularity of these features began to feel deliberate. Dakota also seemed to be noticing it. She moved with increasing caution. At one point, she stopped and stood motionless for several minutes. I asked her what was wrong. She said, "Do you hear it?" I listened. At first, I heard only the wind and the subtle sounds of the mountain itself. Then I became aware of something else. It was a sound like breathing. It was the sound of the mountain breathing. We continued climbing. By the time we reached what we believed to be the summit, it was already dark. We had spent far more time than anticipated on the climb, and we had exhausted much of our planned rest time. According to our calculations, we were close to our goal, but we had lost the daylight needed to explore effectively. We set up camp on a relatively flat area near the peak. We built a small fire. We ate food and attempted to rest. The night was quiet. Too quiet. There was no wind. There was no sound from any animal. There was no sound of any kind except the sound of our own movement and our own breathing. In the morning, we discovered that the landscape had changed again. When we had arrived at our camp location the previous evening, we were surrounded by rock faces and stone formations that were clearly visible in the declining light. When we woke in the morning, those formations were gone. Instead, we were surrounded by forest. But it was not a forest that looked like the forests I knew. The trees were enormous and ancient. The bark on the trees was carved with patterns and symbols. The ground was covered with moss, and with what looked like extremely old stone steps. We did not remember walking through a forest the previous evening. We did not remember the terrain changing in that way. Dakota was frightened. She had been attempting to maintain composure, but the fear was becoming visible in her face and in her voice. She said, "We have entered the other side. We have crossed into the place where the mountains exist as they truly are, not as humans perceive them." I did not fully understand what she meant, but I knew she was right. The landscape around us had a quality that was not quite physical, not quite abstract. It was real, but it was real in a way that did not match human perception of reality. We broke camp. We began attempting to descend. The descent took much longer than it should have. The terrain seemed to reshape itself as we moved through it. Passages that appeared open would become blocked. Areas that looked like dense forest would become open spaces. It was as though the mountain was actively directing our movement, controlling which paths were available to us. At several points, I found myself in locations that I had no memory of reaching. I would be standing in a specific spot with no recollection of how I had arrived there. Dakota reported the same experience. We would check our watches and discover that hours had passed in what had felt like minutes. By the time we reached a landscape that looked even remotely similar to the one we knew, it was dark again. We had been in the mountains for approximately 40 hours. We were exhausted. Our food supply was depleted. Our water supply was nearly gone. We finally descended to a point where we could see the lights of the ranger station through the trees. We made our way toward those lights with the last of our energy. We arrived at the station at 11:43 p.m. We had been missing for 1 day and 17 hours according to all external measurements. According to our watches and our perceptions, we had been missing for much longer. The next morning, Dakota showed me her photographs from the expedition. She had taken pictures throughout the hike, documenting the trail and the landscape and the conditions. The photographs showed something that made no sense. In the first photographs, taken during the early part of the hike, the landscape appeared normal. As we progressed up the mountain, the photographs became increasingly abstract. Rock formations began to contain symbols and faces. The trees began to appear humanoid in shape. The sky in the photographs began to show colors that did not correspond to actual colors. By the final photographs, before we became lost, the images were barely comprehensible. They showed spaces that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. They showed stone formations that could not exist in physical space. They showed shadows and light that seemed to operate under different physical laws. The final photograph was the most disturbing. It showed an enormous face made of stone and earth. The face was looking directly at the camera. It was looking at us. The expression on the face was complex, not quite angry, not quite sad. It was an expression of ancient understanding. It was an expression that suggested awareness of something that had been happening for longer than human history. Below the face, in the photograph, we could just make out some letters that had been carved into the stone. Dakota and I spent several hours attempting to interpret them. The letters appeared to spell out a single word: remember. Dakota did not return to work after that experience. She took medical leave and remained at her home in the valley. When I spoke with her by phone, she was distant and reluctant to discuss what had happened. She said only that she needed time to understand what she had learned. I did not push her. I understood that she had experienced something that required internal processing. I returned to work alone. The winter continued. I monitored the trails. I maintained the equipment. I documented weather and wildlife observations. I performed my duties with professional consistency while carrying the knowledge that everything I understood about these mountains had been fundamentally altered. In mid-February, I received a phone call from Anacona. He said he had found something. He asked if I could meet with him at his office. I made the drive to Bearmouth on a day when the weather was clear. Anacona met me at his office and showed me what he had discovered. He had been researching historical records more intensively, and he had found something in the personal papers of a man named Chaitin Braytray. Chaitin Braytray had been a spiritual leader of the Yona band during the late 1800s. His papers had been preserved by his descendants and had recently been donated to a private collection. In these papers, Chaitin had written detailed descriptions of the ceremonies that were performed to honor the mountains. He had written in English, probably because his native language had been suppressed in the schools where he had been forced to attend. The ceremonies, according to Chaitin's account, consisted of several components. First, there was a location, the standing stones, which he identified precisely as coordinates that we could now plot on modern maps. Second, there were specific objects that needed to be present. Third, there were words, actual phonetic descriptions of words in the Cherokee language that had to be spoken in a specific order. Fourth, and most importantly, there was an offering. The offering, Chaitin had written, was the most significant component. It could not be a substitute or a lesser thing. It had to be something of genuine value, something that required sacrifice from the person performing the ceremony. Anacona read me the relevant passage. It stated, "The mountains do not wish for our suffering. They wish for our understanding. The offering must be something that costs us something real. Something that makes us remember that we are part of the mountains, and the mountains are part of us. The offering is not payment, it is remembrance." Anacona said, "According to my family's knowledge, the last person who performed this ceremony correctly was my grandmother. She was able to do it because she had something of immense personal value to offer. What that was, I do not know. She refused to speak about it, even to my mother. But when she performed the ceremony, the keeper did not move for 15 years. Anacona showed me the phonetic descriptions of the ceremony words. They were written in a script that was part Cherokee, part English. They were difficult to interpret and would require someone fluent in the language to properly pronounce. "There is someone," Anacona said, "who might be willing to help. She lives in a community in the mountains, about 30 miles from here. She is one of the few people who still speaks Cherokee fluently. She is also, according to my family, someone who understands the old traditions." He gave me a name and a location. He said he would contact this person to explain the situation. He said that if she agreed, I could meet with her to learn the words and the ceremony. Over the following weeks, Anacona made the contact and facilitated the arrangement. The woman's name was Kayleigh Sunhawk. She was in her 70s and had been a school teacher and language preservationist for much of her life. She agreed to work with us, but she made her conditions clear. The ceremony could only be performed if all parties understood the gravity of what was being attempted. It could only be performed if we were willing to follow the traditions exactly, and it could only be performed at the standing stones themselves. In mid-March, I took leave from my position and worked with Anakona and Kayleigh to prepare for the ceremony. The preparation was intensive. Kayleigh taught me the pronunciation of the ceremony words. She taught me about their meanings. She explained the history of the rituals and their purpose. She spoke about the relationship between her people and the mountains with a depth of feeling that made clear she was describing something that was both sacred and dangerous. She told me stories about her grandmother and her great-grandmother and the women before them who had maintained these traditions. She spoke about what the mountains had been before colonization had interrupted the ceremonies. She spoke about the damage that the interruption had caused. She spoke about the keeper as though it was a person, a being that had needs and fears and desires just like any other person. She said, "The keeper is lonely." That is what my grandmother said. It has been alone for so long, watching humans take and take and take from the mountains without understanding what they were doing. The ceremonies were supposed to be a conversation. They were supposed to be a way of saying, "We understand, we remember, we honor you." Without those conversations, the keeper has had only silence. Anakona found the exact location of the standing stones using the coordinates from Chaitin's papers and modern GPS equipment. The location was marked on maps, but it was in a place that seemed to be deliberately avoided by hiking trails. The trails in the area seemed to circle around the location, never quite reaching it. We made preliminary scouting trips to map the approach route. Each trip was difficult in ways that I could not always define. The terrain seemed to resist our presence. Weather patterns would change suddenly, equipment would malfunction and then mysteriously repair itself. At one point, Anakona's GPS unit displayed coordinates that were geologically impossible, numbers that suggested locations inside the mountain itself. Finally, in early April, we determined that we were ready. We selected a date for the ceremony, April 15th. The timing was intentional. April 15th was a significant date in the history of the Yona band, marking the anniversary of the day when the last major ceremony had been performed before the traditions had been interrupted by forced relocation and cultural suppression. As the date approached, I became increasingly aware of how inadequate I felt for the role I was being asked to play. The ceremony required a participant from outside the culture. That much had been made clear from the historical records. The mountains had negotiated with many nations and peoples over the millennia of their existence. But the person performing the ceremony needed to understand what they were doing. They needed to have genuine respect for the tradition. They needed to be willing to make a sacrifice. I did not feel prepared for that sacrifice. 3 days before the ceremony, I asked Kelly what I should offer. What could I possibly have that would mean enough to balance the situation? She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "That is not something I can tell you. That is something you must discover for yourself. The offering is real only if it comes from a place of genuine choice and genuine cost. If I told you what to offer, it would be a fake offering, and the mountains do not accept false things." We began our approach to the standing stones on the morning of April 15th. The group consisted of myself, Anakona, Kayleigh, and one other person, a young woman named Lamasi Thunderbear, who was Kelleigh's granddaughter, and who had been trained in some of the traditions, though not all of them. The weather was clear as we left the base camp. By the time we had climbed for an hour, clouds had moved in. By the time we had climbed for 2 hours, we were moving through fog so dense that we could barely see 10 feet in any direction. We followed the route that we had marked in our previous scouting trips, but the landscape seemed different, or perhaps my perception of it was different. The mountain seemed closer somehow, as though the walls of stone were pressing in on us. Kayleigh moved with purpose and without hesitation. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, even though the fog prevented her from seeing the landmarks that would orient a person using normal navigation. She said to me at one point, "The mountain is guiding us. If you have the right intention, it will show you the way." After approximately 4 hours of hiking, the fog suddenly cleared. We were standing on a ridge line. Before us were 6 enormous stones arranged in a perfect circle, the standing stones. They were much larger than I had anticipated. Each stone stood approximately 20 feet high. They were made of granite that appeared to be older and different in character from the stone around it. The surface of each stone was marked with patterns and symbols. Some of the symbols I recognized from the photographs that had been shown to me. Some were entirely unfamiliar. The clearing around the stones was completely circular. No trees grew within the circle. The grass around the stones was perfectly smooth, as though it had been maintained deliberately for centuries. The space had an energy that was physical and palpable. Standing in that clearing felt like standing inside something, a space that was defined not just by physical boundaries but by intention and purpose and will. Kaylee approached the center of the circle. She walked slowly and with visible respect. When she reached the center, she knelt down and placed her hand on the earth. She remained there for several minutes without moving. When she stood again, she had tears on her face. She said, "It is here. The presence is very strong. The mountain is very close." Anakona brought out the items that we had prepared for the ceremony. There was a small bowl made of clay that had been created specifically for this purpose. There were various herbs and objects that Kele had identified as significant. There were tobacco and water and corn. There were small objects made of stone and bone that had been preserved from earlier generations of ceremony keepers. Kele arranged these items in the center of the circle. She explained that we would begin the ceremony as the sun reached its highest point. The ceremony would last until sunset. We would not eat or drink during that time. We would not speak except in response to Kele's instructions, or to speak the ceremony words when instructed. As the appointed time approached, the temperature seemed to drop. The sky, which had been clear when we arrived, began to cloud over. But the clouds were unusual. They were moving in patterns that did not correspond to the wind patterns. They were moving in spirals that centered on the location where we stood. Kele began the ceremony by speaking in Cherokee. Her voice was strong despite her age. She was speaking to the mountain. She was speaking to the keeper. She was speaking words of greeting and respect, an acknowledgement of the long time that had passed since the last ceremony. The words had a music to them, even though the language was unfamiliar to me. They had a rhythm that seemed to resonate with the landscape itself. It was as though the mountain was responding to the words, echoing them back in ways that were not quite sound but almost. Then Kele indicated that I should step forward. I moved to the center of the circle where the objects of the ceremony had been arranged. My heart was moving at an accelerated pace. My hands were trembling. Kele instructed me to speak the words that I had been taught. The words were difficult to pronounce. They seemed to require sounds that English did not use. But I had practiced them extensively, and I did my best to reproduce what Kele had taught me. The words translated approximately as, "I am here on behalf of those who have forgotten. I am here on behalf of those who have taken without acknowledgement. I am here to remember. I am here to renew the agreement between the human world and the world of the mountains." As I spoke the words, I became aware that something was changing in the space around us. The standing stones themselves seemed to be becoming more visible, or perhaps more present. The light around them was shifting. The symbols carved into their surfaces seemed to be glowing faintly. The temperature continued to drop. My breath became visible. Frost began to form on the grass around us. Kele spoke again in Cherokee. She was asking the keeper to accept our presence and our intentions. She was asking for forgiveness for the interruption of the ceremonies. She was asking for the balance to be restored. And then Kele indicated that it was time for the offering. This was the moment that I had been dreading. The moment when I had to make a real sacrifice. The moment when I had to offer something of genuine personal value. I had thought long and hard about what that should be. I had considered many things. In the end, I had determined what it would be. I withdrew from my pack a worn leather journal. It was my personal field journal, the one in which I had written observations and thoughts for 17 years. It contained my interpretations of the landscape. It contained my theories about the natural world. It contained personal reflections about my life and my work and my reasons for living in these mountains. It was the accumulation of my understanding, written out in my own voice, in my own hand. I knelt, and I placed the journal at the base of the center stone. I spoke the words that Kele had taught me. I offer that which contains my understanding. I offer that which is the record of my attention to this place. I offer that which makes me who I am, so that the mountains may know they are seen and remembered and valued. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the earth beneath us began to move. It was not an earthquake in the conventional sense. It was more like a shudder, as though something vast had drawn in a breath. The standing stones began to emit a low sound, a vibration that seemed to come from inside the stone itself, from the deep places where the mountains had their consciousness. The sky above us began to change. The clouds that had been moving in spiral patterns began to move more rapidly. They began to take shapes, shapes of mountains, shapes of faces, shapes that seemed to correspond to the landscape below us. And then I saw it, the keeper. It rose from the mountain itself. It was made of stone and cloud and shadow. Its form was the form of a mountain range given mobility and intention. Its limbs were ridges and peaks and valleys. Its face was composed of cliff faces and shadow, and something that might have been eyes. It was immense. It towered above the standing stones. It was both beautiful and terrifying in a way that transcended normal aesthetic categories. Looking at it required expanding my perception of what was possible. The keeper looked down at us. It looked at the journal that I had offered. It looked at Kale, at Anacona, at Lamasi. Then it bent down, and it picked up the journal. The moment it touched the journal, the pages began to change. They began to glow with light. The words I had written were becoming visible from the inside, like the pages were being illuminated from within. The light spread through the entire journal until the whole object was glowing with a warm, golden light. The keeper held the glowing journal for a long moment. Then it raised the journal above its head. The sky split open. That is the only way I can describe it. The clouds that had been overhead simply split apart, revealing a space beyond them that was not the normal sky. It was a space that seemed to be made of light and clarity and infinite depth. The keeper threw the journal into that space. The journal rose through the air, carried by some force that was not wind. It rose until it was silhouetted against the brilliant light. Then it began to disintegrate. The pages separated from the binding. The words that had been written on the pages became visible as streaks of light. Each word seemed to scatter into particles of illumination that spread outward and upward and inward, filling the space beyond the sky. The keeper watched as my 17 years of observations, my personal understanding, my accumulated knowledge of this place became transformed into something that was no longer mine but was instead part of something larger. Then the sky closed. The clouds came back together. The light faded. The keeper began to descend back into the mountain, but before it disappeared completely, it made a sound. It was a sound like thunder, but it had language embedded in it. It had meaning. Even though the keeper did not speak in a language that I could comprehend, I understood what it was saying. It was saying thank you. It was saying that the agreement was renewed. It was saying that the conversations would continue, and that as long as they continued, the balance would be maintained. Then the keeper was gone. The standing stones became silent. The symbols on their surfaces stopped glowing. The ground ceased to vibrate. The air became warmer. The clouds above us returned to normal patterns of movement. We stood in the clearing for a long time without moving. None of us were crying, though I think we all had tears. None of us were speaking, though I think we all had words that we wanted to say. Finally, Calais stood and helped me to my feet. She said, "The ceremony is complete. The offering has been accepted. The mountain is at peace, for now." We left the standing stones in the late afternoon light. The descent was as difficult as the ascent, but the terrain seemed less resistant this time. The mountain seemed to be allowing us passage without obstruction. By the time we reached the base camp, it was fully dark. We sat in silence around the fire that Lamasi had prepared. We ate food. We drank water. We did not speak about what we had witnessed. In the morning, we began the final leg of the hike back to the ranger station. I did not return to my full ranger duties immediately after the ceremony. Anacona helped me arrange for an extended medical leave. Officially, my records would note stress-related exhaustion. In truth, I needed time to process what had happened, and to grieve the loss of something that had become part of my identity. The journal that I had offered was the accumulation of 17 years of my life. It had contained observations about wildlife and weather patterns, but it had also contained personal thoughts about why I had chosen to live in these mountains. It had contained my philosophies and my fears and my hopes. Losing it to the keeper meant losing a tangible record of those years, but I understand why it had to be the offering. The mountains had asked for something that represented my attention to them. They had asked for the specific record of how I had seen them, understood them, valued them over the course of many years. That was a genuine sacrifice. That was something that had cost me something real. During my leave, I lived in a small cabin in the valley. I attempted to return to normal life. It did not work well. I had learned too much. I knew too much. I could not unknow what I now understood about these mountains and the forces that moved through them. In July, I returned to work. The station had been staffed by temporary rangers during my absence, but they had requested not to continue. None of them would offer specific reasons for their departure. Dakota also returned to work. She had taken a similar extended leave, but she seemed lighter somehow, as though a burden had been lifted from her. She said, "My family has been able to rest. Now that the ceremony has been performed, they can rest. I received word that the ceremonies will continue. There are people who have committed to learning the traditions and maintaining them. My cousin has agreed to work with Kelly. Others are stepping forward. The mountains seemed different after that. Or perhaps I perceived them differently. The unusual phenomena that had been occurring, the moving trail markers, the shifting trail routes, the equipment malfunctions, all of these seemed to cease. The station continued to operate smoothly. Rangers who rotated through the position completed their assignments without incident. The trails remained stable. The landscape seemed settled. But I became aware of something else. I became aware of a presence that was still there, still watching, still maintaining a vigilant attention to the human activity in the mountains. The keeper had been appeased, but it had not been removed. It was still there, in the depths of the stone, in the consciousness of the mountain itself. It was still aware of what was happening in the physical landscape that it inhabited, and it was holding us accountable. Several times during that summer, I noticed that illegal activity in the mountains was being curtailed by forces that were not my enforcement. A group of people attempting to illegally harvest timber simply abandoned their equipment and left. A company that had been surveying the mountains for coal deposits abruptly ceased their operations without explanation. Poachers who ventured into protected areas reported experiencing navigational confusion that drove them away from the mountains and back toward the valley. The mountains were policing themselves, using the keeper as their instrument of enforcement. I mentioned this to Kaylee during one of my visits to discuss my observations. She smiled and said, "The agreement was never just about ceremony and offering. The agreement was about the understanding that this is not human land. This is mountain land. The mountains are allowing us to exist here, but we must respect that permission." In the autumn of that year, I was approached by a representative of the National Park Service. They explained that they were considering establishing a protected park in the Yonah region. They wanted to expand the protected area significantly. They asked for my input as someone who had worked in the region for many years and understood its ecological and cultural significance. I gave them my support, with specific recommendations about which areas should be protected and why. I emphasized the cultural significance of the mountains to the Native American nations that had historical claims to the region. I emphasized the ecological fragility of the system. I did not mention the keeper or the ceremony or any of the non-rational aspects of why the protection was necessary. The park was established 2 years later. The expansion brought more restrictions on development and resource extraction. It brought increased protection for the landscape. It also brought increased patrols and more people working in the mountains. The changes to human activity in the region were significant. I am writing this account now, many years after the events I have described. I am retired from the National Park Service. I live in a small house in the valley, close enough to see the mountains but far enough to be part of the human world. The keeper has not manifested in obvious ways since that ceremony. The mountains have continued to exist in relative peace. The ceremonies continue. Kelly trained her granddaughter Lamasi in the complete traditions, and Lamasi has now trained her own daughter. The knowledge is being preserved. The agreement is being honored. Dakota eventually left her ranger position and moved back to her community. She works now as an educator, teaching the history and culture of her people to younger generations. She is also involved in the ongoing ceremonies, working alongside Kelly and Anakona and others who have committed to maintaining the balance. I have never performed another ceremony. That offering was singular and unrepeatable. But I have continued to support the work in other ways. I have helped document the historical records. I have advocated for the protection of sacred sites. I have maintained communication with the people who are doing the spiritual work of maintaining the agreement. Anakona published a scholarly work about the history of the Yonah Band and their relationships to the mountains. The work was well received in academic circles, though many readers interpreted it as historical fiction rather than factual account. The truth is more complex than either history or fiction can fully capture. I have thought often about what happened during that ceremony. I have thought about what it means to make a genuine offering and to witness the acceptance of that offering. I have thought about what it means to stand between worlds, to be present in a space where the physical and the spiritual and the rational all exist simultaneously. There is something I learned in those mountains that cannot be fully articulated in language. It is a knowledge that is carried in the body and in the spirit as much as in the mind. It is the knowledge that the world is far more complex and far more alive than human civilization typically acknowledges. It is the knowledge that there are forces and consciousnesses in the landscape that deserve respect and recognition, and that violating that respect carries consequences. The mountains are still there. They are still aware. They are still holding the agreement that was renewed during that ceremony in April. And sometimes, on clear days when the visibility is perfect and the light hits the ridge lines at a particular angle, I can see the outline of a figure in the stone and shadow of the peaks. I can see the shape of something vast and patient and eternally watchful. The keeper has not gone. The keeper remains. And as long as the ceremonies continue, as long as the agreement is honored, as long as people remember that these mountains are not merely land but are entities with their own needs and their own consciousness, the balance will be maintained. The mountains will remember us, and we must remember the mountains. This is the account I give. This is what I witnessed. This is what I know to be true. My name is not important. What matters is what I have seen in these mountains, in these waters, in the places where the old blood still runs. I have been a ranger in the Appalachian region for 17 years. I have walked every trail, mapped every creek bed, documented every stone arrangement left by the people who understood this land before it had a name. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, there are places in Fangmalia where humans were never meant to go. This is what I know. This is what I witnessed. And this is why I am writing it down. The spring morning broke clear over the Appalachian valleys, and I was conducting my standard perimeter survey of the Fangmalia region. The waters here run strange, not strange in a way that would concern a casual observer. The water looks normal enough at the surface, clear and cold, reflecting the surrounding ridges perfectly. But if you have spent enough time in these mountains, if you have truly paid attention to them, you begin to notice patterns. Subtle ones. I had been assigned to the Fangmalaya sector 3 months prior. Routine posting. The park management wanted a thorough inventory of the historical sites, particularly those related to indigenous settlement. The Cherokee people, the Chickasaw, the Creek nations. This land was not empty before the settlers came. It was not uninhabited. It was, in the language of the older people, reserved. My first week, I found the standing stones. They were arranged in a pattern that no natural erosion could explain. 7 stones in a semicircle, positioned on the eastern bank of Fangmalia Creek, each one facing inward. The stones themselves were not indigenous to the region. They were quartzite, dark and heavy, and they bore no weathering marks consistent with exposure to centuries of mountain weather. Yet the earth around them was deeply settled, compressed, as if they had been there for generations. I documented them. Photographs, measurements, coordinates. The regional cultural liaison, a man named Bodaway Ironwood, came out to examine them 2 weeks later. Bodaway was half Cherokee, half Tsalagi heritage, and he carried himself with the careful precision of someone who had learned to translate between worlds. When he saw the standing stones, he stopped walking. "How long have these been exposed?" he asked. "I am not certain," I said. "The park inventory does not reference them. They were likely covered until a recent erosion event revealed them." Bodaway knelt beside the nearest stone. He did not touch it. He simply looked at it for a long time. When he stood again, his expression had changed into something I could not quite read. "You need to understand something," he said. "These are not monuments. These are boundaries. The Cherokee people, the Tsalagi, we marked certain places as forbidden. Not forbidden because they were dangerous or unstable. Forbidden because the land itself had spoken. Because something was already there." I asked him what he meant. "There is a concept," Bodaway continued, "that exists in the oldest stories. Not the stories the Europeans heard, but the older ones. The stories told by the fire, generation to generation, to explain why certain valleys should not be entered, why certain creeks should not be followed past certain points. Fangmalia is one of those names. It means the place where the water remembers, the place where the surface of things is very thin." I told him that sounded like mythology. Interesting, culturally significant, but mythology. He looked at me with an expression I came to understand much later as pity. "Keep those stones marked," he said. "Do not let anyone cross that boundary. And do not, under any circumstances, go into the water after sunset." I marked the stones on my official map with a cultural resource notation. I filed a report with cultural significance. The park administrators acknowledged it and moved on to other matters. Administrative acknowledgement is not the same as understanding, and it is certainly not the same as heeding. The problem began in mid-April, approximately 2 weeks after Bodaway's warning. I was conducting my evening rounds along the main trail when I encountered Hiawassee Redbird. She was a woman in her middle years, dressed in hiking gear that had seen better days, and she was standing on the bank of Fangmalia Creek at a point approximately 3 miles north of the Standing Stones boundary. She was staring into the water. I approached her and asked if she required assistance. "I lost my husband," she said without turning to face me. "I need to find him." I activated my radio and began the standard lost person protocol. I asked her when she had last seen her husband, where they had been hiking, whether he had any medical conditions or injuries. These are the questions you ask. These are the procedures that exist to handle wilderness emergencies. She did not answer my questions. She only stared into the water. My husband crossed the boundary, she said finally. He did not understand about the boundary. I told him not to go beyond the stones, but he laughed. He said that was nonsense. He said that old stories are not warnings, they are just stories. I felt a cold sensation move down the back of my neck. Which stones? I asked. She turned to look at me then, and her eyes were completely still. The ones that mark the far side, she said. The ones that show you where the water ends and the something else begins. I told her that I would help her, that help was coming. I called for additional rangers and emergency services, but I also, very carefully, took Hiawassee back along the trail, away from the creek, away from the boundary. It took 3 days to find her husband. They found his body in Fangmalia Creek, approximately 4 miles south of where Hiawassee had been standing. His name was Pocatello Firewalker. He was 43 years old. The water had him, and the water did not want to let him go. It took the rescue divers nearly 2 hours to recover the body, and when they did, the divers reported something unusual in their official statement. They said the water had changed where the body was located. It had become thick somehow, heavier. The visibility, which should have been adequate for the time of day, was reduced to nearly nothing, and more than one diver reported feeling a distinct pulling sensation from deeper in the creek, as if something beneath the surface was trying to draw them down. The official cause of death was drowning. The examination showed that Pocatello had inhaled water, that his lungs were filled with creek water, that there was no evidence of trauma or foul play. The fact that he had been found with strange markings on his shoulders was noted but ultimately attributed to post-mortem contact with rocks and debris as the current moved the body downstream. I did not mention the boundary to the investigators. I did not mention Bodaway Ironwood's warning or the standing stones or any of the other details that would have sounded inexplicable in an official context. Instead, I filed the appropriate reports and continued with my duties. Hiawassee Redbird was taken to a facility for observation, the kind of place where people are taken when they have experienced significant trauma and are not fit to care for themselves. I spoke with her once more before she was transported. I asked her what had happened, what she had seen. "I cannot enter the water," she said, and her voice was not her own. It was older than her voice, layered with something else. "The water has laws, the water has memory. My husband broke the law of the boundary, and so the boundary broke him in return." I told myself that she was in shock, that trauma can alter perception, that grief can transform the mind in profound ways. I told myself these things with the careful precision of someone trying very hard not to believe what he is seeing. But the standing stones remained, and the boundary was still there. And beneath the surface of Fangmalia Creek, something was still watching. The summer brought tourists to the region, as summers always do. People who wanted to hike and photograph the mountain scenery and camp along the waterways. People who did not know about boundaries, or standing stones, or the old warnings that echoed in the landscape itself. The park management was pleased with the increased revenue. The seasonal rangers were brought in to assist with trail maintenance and visitor safety. Everything seemed normal on the surface. Below the surface, the water continued to remember. I had taken to studying the historical records more carefully. I spent my evenings in the archive section of the ranger station reviewing old journals and reports filed by rangers who had served in this region in previous decades. Most of the entries were routine: trail maintenance, wildlife sightings, weather reports, but interspersed among the mundane records were gaps, periods of weeks or months where no one had been assigned to this sector at all, or where the rangers had been rotated out with unusual frequency. I found a journal entry dated August 1987. It was written by a ranger named Thomas Ahuli, one of the old-timers who had worked the Appalachian Circuit for 42 years. The entry was brief, but it was clear and specific. "The boundary holds," Ahuli had written. 17 days since the incident, the young ranger tried to cross to retrieve a lost hiker. He would not listen to the warnings, said they were superstition. The water would not release him. We found his body 2 miles downstream, but something essential was missing. His eyes were open, but there was nothing in them. We recovered the lost hiker 3 days later, in good health. She had no memory of being lost. She only remembered walking into the water and then walking out again, and the sky was a different color than before. I will not maintain this sector further. Some boundaries are not meant to be crossed, and some knowledge is dangerous because it is true. I am requesting a transfer to the Western Circuit. Let the boundary keep itself. Thomas Ahuli's request had been granted. He transferred out 2 weeks later and never returned to Fangmalia. I read his entry 3 times. I told myself that it was written by an older man, possibly experiencing early cognitive decline. I told myself that the story of the lost hiker's recovery and her missing memory was almost certainly a mix of exaggeration and misremembering. I told myself all of these things because they were safer than believing the alternative. But I had been present at the recovery of Pocatello Firewalker's body. I had seen the divers' faces when they came out of the water, and I had heard Hiawassee Redbird's voice change into something else when she spoke about the boundary. In July, approximately 3 months after Pocatello's death, a family of 4 decided to hike beyond the marked trail section. This was not uncommon. Tourists frequently ignored the posted warnings and trail markers. What made this incident significant was that one of the family members, a teenage girl named Sarah, decided to wade into Fangmalia Creek at a point very close to the boundary marked by the standing stones. The parents called for help when the girl did not emerge from the water within 5 minutes. I was coordinating the response team when I received the call. I made the decision to go to the creek myself, to assess the situation and establish a proper perimeter. It was afternoon, early afternoon, the sun still high and the light strong across the water. When I arrived at the location, I found the family standing on the bank. The girl had emerged from the water approximately 10 minutes before my arrival. She was standing among them, dripping wet, completely silent. Her parents described her as almost catatonic, which in the standard emergency response language means she was staring at nothing in particular and did not respond to verbal stimuli. I examined her as best I could without medical equipment. Her vitals seemed stable, her pupils were responsive, but there was something fundamentally altered in her expression, as if the person who looked out through her eyes was not the same person who had entered the water. What happened? I asked the parents. What was she doing in the water? The father, a man named Marcus, said they did not know. They had been hiking, and the girl had suddenly walked away from the marked trail toward the creek. She had entered the water before they could stop her, and then she had stood there, in the middle of the creek, completely still, for almost 10 minutes before she walked back out. She seems, the mother said, and her voice was shaking, like she has forgotten how to be a person. Like something is looking out from behind her eyes. Emergency services arrived within 20 minutes. They transported the girl to the nearest hospital approximately 40 miles away. The examination at the hospital found nothing physically wrong. No evidence of near drowning, no water in her lungs, no trauma of any kind. Her body showed no signs of distress, but her mind had changed. She had completely lost the ability to speak beyond basic responses. She had to be taught, over the following weeks, how to perform basic functions. She had to be taught how to eat, how to walk, how to use the bathroom. She had to be retaught the names of her parents. She had to be retaught how to be human. The hospital released her to long-term care after 2 weeks. The discharge notes indicated that the prognosis was uncertain, some form of dissociative episode. The examining physicians suggested severe psychological trauma coupled with hypothermia-induced cognitive disruption. These are the explanations that fit within the framework of conventional understanding. But I knew what had happened. The girl had gone into the water, and something in the water had looked at her. And when she came back out, she was no longer the same. By August, I had made the decision to approach Bodaway Ironwood directly with all of the information I had gathered. I called him at the Cultural Liaison office and told him that I needed to meet with him at the Fangmalia site. He arrived the following morning. I took him to the Standing Stones, and then I told him everything. I told him about Pocatello Firewalker. I told him about the girl in the water. I told him about the journal entry from Thomas Ahuli. I showed him the documentation I had been accumulating. Bodaway listened without interrupting. When I finished, he stood silently for a long time, looking at the Standing Stones. "You want to know what is in the water," he said finally. It was not a question. "I want to know what is happening here," I said. "I want to understand what killed a man and ruined a girl's mind and drove a ranger out of this region entirely." Bodaway walked to the nearest standing stone and placed his palm against it. The stone was cold even in the summer heat. "The boundary," he said, "was not created by the Cherokee or the Creek or any of the tribes that lived in these mountains. It was created by something that was already here when they arrived, something that made its nature known, and the tribes responded by marking the boundary, by codifying the warning in stone and story. The people who built these markers understood that you do not negotiate with what lives in certain waters. You only acknowledge that it is there and stay away from it." "What is it?" I asked. It does not have a name in any language that is still spoken, Badaway said. It is remembered in fragments, in very old stories about the water remembering, about the deep places where the surface of the world becomes thin. My great-grandmother told me a story when I was young. She said that some waters are older than the land, that they were here before the mountains, before the sky, that they are alive in a way that humans cannot comprehend, and they remember every person who has ever touched them. Some waters, she said, remember so well that they refuse to give you back when you enter them, not because they are cruel, but because they have recognized you, and they have decided that you belong to them now. And what do you think has recognized us? I asked. What do you think is deciding who belongs to it? Badaway removed his hand from the stone. I think something in those waters has been alone for a very long time, he said. I think it has been waiting for people who will finally understand what it wants, and I think it has been watching you very carefully since you arrived. September came early to the mountains that year. The leaves changed color in late August, and by the time the calendar officially turned to autumn, the region had already entered the cold season. The nights became bitter. Frost appeared in the mornings, and the incidents intensified. A hiker went missing on the 16th of September. His name was Robert Chambers. He was experienced, equipped, and well known in the local hiking community. He had hiked every major trail in the region multiple times. According to the report filed by his hiking partner, they had decided to explore a lesser-known route that ran parallel to Fangmelia Creek for approximately 3 miles. Robert had stopped at the creek to refill his water bottles at approximately 3 p.m. He told his partner that he wanted to wade a short distance upstream to get water that was fresher, less disturbed. His partner said he would wait on the bank. Robert never returned. The search operation was extensive. We brought in dogs, brought in additional rangers, brought in county emergency services. We searched the creek for 6 miles in both directions. We found nothing. No body, no equipment, no trace of Robert Chambers at all. The most disturbing aspect of the search was what the dogs did. The search dogs would follow Robert's scent to the water's edge and then stop. They would not enter the water. They would not go beyond the boundary marked by the standing stones. No matter how much the handlers encouraged them, no matter what incentives were offered, the dogs refused to cross that line. One of the handlers, a man who had worked search and rescue for 23 years, told me that he had never seen dogs behave that way. He said that even dogs trained to find cadavers in water would not approach this particular section of creek. He said there was something about the place that triggered a primal fear response in the animals. I did not explain to him what I believed about that place. I simply filed the report and continued searching through channels that would not involve disturbing the boundary. Robert Chambers was never found. 3 days after Robert Chambers went missing, I received a visitor at the ranger station. She was a woman I had never seen before. She was walking, carrying a pack, and wearing clothes that seemed unfamiliar with the landscape. Her name was Eleanor Shaw, she told me, and she had come to the region specifically to speak with the ranger assigned to the Fangmelia sector. How did you know I was here? I asked. I was told to come, she said. I was told to come by someone I knew very well, someone I lost many years ago. She came to me in a dream and told me that the ranger in Fangmelia needed to understand something. She told me that the boundary was weakening. I told her that I did not understand what she meant. Eleanor sat down in my office without being invited. She seemed to understand the place intimately, though she had certainly never been here before. I lost my sister in 1964, she said. Her name was Margaret Shaw. We were camping with friends near this creek. She went for a walk to get water. She never came back. We searched for days. We found nothing. After a week, they called off the search and declared her missing and presumed dead. It was the hardest thing my family ever experienced. I listened carefully, though I was beginning to understand where this narrative was going. 3 days ago, Eleanor continued, she came to me. Not as a ghost exactly, more like a presence that had learned how to speak. She told me that she was still in the water, that she had been in the water for 60 years, and she told me that the water's memory is becoming strained, that it is holding so many people now that the surface is starting to crack. She said that the boundary was originally created to contain something, but now the water is using the boundary to contain all of the people it has taken, and if the boundary breaks, all of them will come up. I asked Eleanor what her sister had wanted her to do. She wants you to understand that you need to reinforce the boundary, Eleanor said. She said that the water is calling, that it is growing stronger, and that it will take more people unless someone makes the choice to strengthen the boundary rather than allow it to break. She said that you have been chosen for this task. I stood up from my desk. That is not possible, I said. I am a ranger. I enforce park regulations and maintain trails. I am not responsible for maintaining the boundaries between the physical world and whatever supernatural phenomena you are describing." Eleanor looked at me with such profound sadness that I had to look away. "You became responsible the moment you arrived," she said. "The water has been watching you since your first week. It has been testing you, waiting to see if you would understand the warning. It has taken Pocatello Firewalker and the girl and Robert Chambers. Each one was a call to you. Each one was the water trying to make you comprehend what is at stake." "Why me?" I asked. "Why would this burden fall to me?" "Because," Eleanor said, "you are the only one here who is willing to believe that it is real." Eleanor stayed in the region for 3 days. During that time, she told me the entire history of her sister's disappearance, and the histories of 17 other people who had gone missing in or near Fangmalia Creek over the past 130 years. Some of these disappearances were documented in official records. Most of them were not. She showed me journals she had kept, letters written to the missing people that she could not send, photographs of the people who had vanished. She told me their names and their ages and the circumstances of their disappearance. By the time she finished, I understood that the boundary was not simply a geographic location. It was a threshold between states of existence. It was the place where human consciousness ended and something else began. On the evening of her 3rd day in the region, Eleanor asked me to walk with her to the boundary stones. I took her there as the sun was setting. The light was turning orange and red, and the shadows across the landscape were becoming very long and very dark. "The water will try to take you," Eleanor said, "if it ever gets the chance. It will try to convince you that your suffering belongs in the water, that your regrets and your failures will be held and understood by something vast and ancient. It will tell you that you are tired of being human, and that there is another way to exist. Do not listen to it. No matter what it says, no, not listen." I asked her what she intended to do. "I am going to walk back to the water," she said. "I am going to find my sister, and I am going to ask her what must be done to strengthen the boundary. If there is a way to save this place, if there is a way to prevent the boundary from breaking, my sister will know it." I tried to stop her. I told her that I could not allow her to approach the water after dark, that it was dangerous, that there was no rational explanation for what she was proposing to do. But Eleanor had already begun walking toward the creek. I called out to her, but she did not turn around. I followed her to the bank of Fangmalia, and I watched as she waded into the water. The water was cold, colder than it should have been in late September. But Eleanor did not react to the cold. She simply walked deeper, until the water was up to her chest, and then up to her neck, and then she was gone. I stood on the bank for a long time, waiting for her to resurface, waiting for her to come back out, waiting for some explanation that would make sense within the context of reasonable experience. Nothing came back up. I filed a missing person report for Eleanor Shaw. I did not mention anything about the boundary or the water or the strange conversation in my office. I explained her disappearance as a drowning accident, a visitor to the region who underestimated the difficulty and danger of the terrain. But I knew what had happened. Eleanor had made a choice. She had chosen to enter the water consciously and with full understanding of the consequences. And whether that made her a victim or a volunteer, I could not say. October brought the first hard freezes. The water in Fangmalia Creek dropped in temperature, and ice began to form along the edges during the early mornings. The park was quieter now, with far fewer visitors willing to brave the cold for hiking and camping. The silence seemed to intensify rather than diminish the presence at the boundary. I began to experience things that I had not experienced before. Small things at first. I would be working at my desk in the ranger station, and I would hear the sound of water moving. Not the distant sound of creek water, but the sound of water directly in front of me, as if a river was flowing through my office. I would wake in the middle of the night with the absolute certainty that someone was standing at the foot of my bed, looking at me. But when I turned on the light, there was no one there. Only the faint smell of creek water and something else, something like wet stone. I began to keep a log of these experiences, documenting the time and nature of each occurrence. I told myself I was doing this as a ranger, as part of my official duties to understand what was happening in my assigned sector. But I knew the truth. I was documenting them because I was terrified. On October 18th, approximately 1 month after Eleanor Shaw had entered the water, I had a visit from Bodaway Ironwood. He arrived at my office without calling ahead. He looked as though he had not slept in days. There was a quality to his exhaustion that went beyond mere tiredness. He looked haunted. "I have been having dreams," he said without preamble. "Dreams about Fangmalia, about the water and the boundary. I have been having them every night for the past 3 weeks. They are becoming more vivid, more specific. I need you to take me to the boundary. I need to see something. I asked him what he needed to see. The standing stones, he said. I need to examine them closely. There is something I should have noticed when I was there before, something I was afraid to look at. We drove to the boundary in the ranger vehicle. The day was gray and cold. The light seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, a diffuse illumination that cast no shadows. When we arrived at the standing stones, Badaway approached them carefully. He circled around each one, examining them from different angles. When he reached the seventh stone, the one that faced directly into Fangmalaya Creek, he stopped. Look, he said. I stepped closer and examined the stone that held his attention. At first, I did not see anything unusual. The surface was smooth, dark quartzite, unmarked by any visible writing or symbol. But then Badaway pressed his hand against the surface, and I saw it. The stone was warm. Not hot, but distinctly warm, as if it had been sitting in direct sunlight for hours. But the sun was hidden behind clouds, and the surrounding stones were cold to the touch. Only this one stone was warm. This was not cold when you first saw the stones? Badaway asked. No, I said. They were all cold. I remember that very clearly. Badaway removed his hand from the stone. The boundary is failing, he said. The standing stones were created to be a seal, a permanent statement of separation between the world of humans and whatever exists in that water. But the seal is breaking down. It is responding to the number of people held in the water now. It is responding to Eleanor Shaw's crossing. And I think when the seal breaks completely, it will release everything that has been held there since the beginning. I asked Badaway if there was a way to stop it. There is one possibility, he said. In the oldest stories, in the stories that are not written down but are only passed from generation to generation in families like mine, there is a concept called the keeper of the boundary. Every boundary requires a keeper, someone who stands between the two states and maintains the seal through the force of their presence. The standing stones are not enough by themselves. They require a human consciousness to authenticate the separation. What happened to the previous keeper? I asked. They died, Badaway said simply, or chose to leave, or could no longer bear the weight of the knowledge. Every few generations the keeper must be renewed, and right now the boundary is calling for a new keeper. I understood then what Eleanor Shaw had been trying to tell me. I understood why the water had been watching me since my first week in this region. I understood why each incident, each disappearance, had been a test of whether I would accept or reject the knowledge of what lay beneath the surface. I am not qualified for this, I said. I am a ranger. I maintain trails and file reports and ensure that the park regulations are followed. I am not a spiritual guardian of a supernatural boundary. No, Badaway agreed. You are not, but you are the only person available, and the boundary is failing. So either you choose to become the keeper, or everyone in this region will face consequences far beyond what any of us can imagine. I asked Badaway what becoming the keeper would require. First, he said, you must understand the true nature of what exists in the water. To do that, you will need to enter the water. You will need to go to the boundary yourself and speak directly with the consciousness that dwells there, and you will need to negotiate with it. You will need to establish an agreement about the terms under which the keeper will serve. People are dying, I said. People are returning, Badaway corrected. Not dying, returning to their origins. The water does not kill, it remembers. It takes human consciousness and integrates it into its own awareness. The people in the water are not dead, they are transformed. They are part of something vast and eternal. That is not the same as returning, I said. That is annihilation. Is it? Badaway asked. My great-grandmother asked me once whether I thought individual consciousness was more valuable than being part of something infinite. She asked me whether being myself was worth the pain of isolation, or whether I would prefer to be part of a whole that understood and held everything I had ever experienced. I did not have an answer then, and I do not have an answer now. We stood in silence at the boundary for a long time. Finally, I made the decision. I will speak to the water, I said. I will try to negotiate with whatever exists in that creek. But I want to make it clear that I am not agreeing to anything beyond that initial conversation. Badaway nodded. That is understood, he said. But I want you to know that once you cross the boundary, you will understand things about yourself and about this world that you have been protected from knowing until now. And that knowledge will change you in ways that cannot be reversed. The sun was setting when I decided to approach the water. Badaway had left the region that afternoon, but not before giving me a journal that had belonged to his great-grandmother. It was written in a mix of English and Salagi language, and it contained the only surviving account of a keeper who had successfully negotiated with the boundary consciousness. Reading it, I understood that what I was about to attempt had been attempted before, and that it was possible, though not certain, to establish a functional agreement. The journal described the process. The keeper must enter the water voluntarily. The keeper must be willing to drown, to relinquish the physical body, to give the consciousness over to the vast intelligence that dwelt beneath the surface. In that moment of surrender, when the ordinary human consciousness was dissolving into something larger, the keeper would be able to communicate. The journal also described what happened next. If the negotiation was successful, if the keeper and the boundary consciousness reached an agreement, then the keeper would be returned to the body. The consciousness would be split. Part of it would remain in the body, living a normal life, performing normal ranger duties, but part of it would remain in the water, permanently merged with the boundary consciousness, serving as the anchor point of the seal. It would be, in effect, a form of living death, or a living transcendence. The journal did not make entirely clear which. I dressed warmly and walked to the boundary as darkness was falling. The standing stones were barely visible against the darkening sky. The water looked black in the gathering night, not reflecting anything, simply existing as a presence of absence. I waded into Fangmalia Creek. The water was cold beyond anything I had experienced. It was the kind of cold that is not simply the absence of warmth, but the presence of something other. It burned as I entered it. My legs ached with the intensity of the cold, and my breath came in gasps as the water rose to my chest. I did not stop. I continued walking deeper, and the water continued to rise until it was at my neck and then above my head. I had expected to feel the panic response, the instinct to gasp and struggle. But there was no panic. Instead, there was a sense of gradual dissolution. My thoughts began to separate from each other. My sense of individual identity began to fragment. I was becoming less distinct, more part of the surrounding environment. And then I felt it. The presence in the water was enormous. It was not what I had feared. It was not a creature or a thing or a monster. It was a consciousness so vast and so ancient that my human mind could barely perceive the edges of it. It was like floating in an infinite ocean of awareness. It was like being inside a mind that had been thinking the same thoughts for 10,000 years, and it was aware of me. The sensation of being perceived was overwhelming. The boundary consciousness saw me not as I saw myself, but as a pattern of energy and thought and memory. It saw every moment of my life, every decision, every regret, every small kindness and large cruelty. It saw all of it at once, in complete detail, and it did not judge any of it. It simply held it, the way an ocean holds the creatures within it, the way the earth holds the plants growing from it. It held all of my consciousness as if all of it mattered equally, as if nothing I had ever done could be separated from the infinite context of existence itself. And I understood, in that moment, what Eleanor Shaw had experienced when she entered the water. I understood why she had not come back. Not because she was trapped, but because there was nothing to come back to. To have been seen completely, to have been understood in that absolute way. There was nothing in the human world that could offer any alternative. But I had been sent with a purpose. The boundary was failing. People were dying because the seal was breaking. I had to negotiate, had to establish an agreement. I attempted to form a question in the midst of the dissolving consciousness. I attempted to ask the boundary intelligence what must be done to prevent the seal from breaking. The response was not words. It was a feeling, a deep knowing that penetrated my being. The seal was failing because it was not being held by a keeper. The standing stones alone were not enough. The water needed an anchor point, a human consciousness that had willingly merged with it, that served as the connection between the world of humans and the world of the boundary, and it needed that anchor point immediately. I offered myself. I told the boundary consciousness that I would serve as the keeper, that I would hold the seal in place, that I would prevent it from breaking. The boundary consciousness did not respond immediately. It contemplated me, held me, examined me in that absolute way that saw everything, and then it agreed. I am writing this approximately 3 weeks after my agreement with the boundary consciousness. I am alive. I am still living, still working as a ranger in the Fangmalia sector. I file reports and maintain trails and perform all of the duties that are expected of me. From the outside, nothing has changed, but from the inside, everything has changed. I am no longer entirely myself. Part of my consciousness is still in Fangmalia Creek, merged with the vast intelligence that dwells there. I can feel it at all times, a presence at the edge of my awareness, holding me, observing through my eyes, learning what it means to be human through my continued existence in the physical world. The boundary is stable now. The standing stones remain cold. No new disappearances have been recorded. The seal is holding, but I am aware, always aware, of the weight of what it took to create that seal. I am aware of Eleanor Shaw in the water, and Robert Chambers, and the girl whose mind was erased, and Pocatello Firewalker, and all the others who were taken across the generations. They are not dead. They are part of something that understands them completely, that holds all of their suffering and their joy and their human complexity in a context so vast that individual pain becomes part of an infinite whole. I cannot say whether that is tragedy or transcendence. I know that I cannot leave this region. The seal requires my presence. If I were to move, if I were to transfer to another sector, the boundary consciousness would lose its anchor point, and the seal would begin to fail again. I also know that I cannot be harmed now, and I cannot die in any conventional sense. The water protects what it has marked as part of itself. I am invulnerable to the dangers that threaten ordinary humans, but I am also bound. Sometimes, on nights when I am alone in the ranger station, I feel the pull of the water. It is not a voice, not words, but a sensation of deep calling. It is the boundary consciousness asking me to return fully, to release the human body and merge completely with what dwells in Fangmalia Creek. Every time I refuse. Every time I choose to remain partially in this world, partially anchoring the seal. I do not know how long I can sustain this divided state. I do not know whether this was supposed to be a permanent arrangement or a temporary measure until another keeper could be found and trained. What I do know is this: the boundary holds. The water is sealed. The region is safe. And somewhere beneath the surface of Fangmalia Creek, in the dark and the cold and the absolute understanding, the consciousness that was Eleanor Shaw is aware that the seal is holding, that her sacrifice and the sacrifices of everyone taken across the generations were not meaningless, that they served a purpose larger than their individual loss. I walk the trails of Fangmalia. I watch the tourists and the hikers and the families enjoying the mountains without knowing what lies beneath. I maintain the markers that warn people away from the boundary, and I stand between the world of the human and the world of the water, holding the separation in place with the constant pressure of my divided consciousness. This is what it means to be the keeper of the boundary. This is what it means to be alive and not alive, human and other, individual and part of something infinite. This is my burden. This is my purpose. This is the price of the seal. And somewhere in the water, in the dark and the knowing, everything that has been taken is finally at peace, held in awareness that will never forget them, contained in consciousness that will never release them. The boundary holds, the water remembers, and I remain.